Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm going to start a new series, What If Deku Was the Dark Knight of MHA Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
The car ride home was a monstrous silence. It wasn't the quiet type that congregates in libraries or right before sunrise. More than the summer humidity, the silence was heavy and thick, bloated with unsaid words that clung to the upholstery and fogged the windows. Izuku Midoriya, age 4, sensed it. He sensed the pressure of his mother's eyes on the road, so intense that it appeared as though she was using all of her strength to keep the asphalt intact. In a detached and clinical manner, the doctor had been kind. The words he used were big and smooth, like genetic factor, superfluous joint in the pinky, and statistical probability. They shattered on the floor and slid through Izuku's ears, leaving only one sharp truth: no quirk. Not a quirk. It was equivalent to being essentially broken from birth in today's society. It's an absence rather than a disease or officially recognized disability. A gap where something essential ought to be. Izuku's tiny fingers squeezed the bottom of his All Might action figure so firmly that the plastic dug into his palm as he gazed out the window. He observed pedestrians on the pavement. A woman picked up a dropped can by growing vines from her purse. A businessman flicked his thumb to light his cigarette, creating a tiny flame. Daily peculiarities. As typical as breathing. The world was woven together with them. And the edges of him were fraying. Izuku said, "Mama," in a voice that was hardly audible. As though waking from a trance, Inko took a moment to respond. "Yes, sweetheart," she said in a frail voice. "All Might, he always smiles, right?" Inko's cheek rolled down with a single, fat, silent tear. "Yes, honey. He always smiles so people can feel safe. Even when things go bad," she said, "especially when things go bad," with a final crack in her voice. Slowly, Izuku nodded as he processed. He glanced at the All Might figure once more. The painted smile, heroic and unwavering. Then he saw himself reflected in the window, a pale child with untidy hair and large eyes, a storm he had not yet been able to name. He made an effort to smile. The outcome was a weak, pitiful grimace. He felt insecure. The smile didn't help either. The scene was set that night. The video of All Might's debut, the one with the computer, rubble, smoke, and that loud laugh. Izuku turned in his chair and asked, "Can I be a hero?" His body shook with a hope that would not die. The reality of a mother's suffering is something that epic tales never address. Inko wept over her son's dashed hopes, but she did more. She let out a sigh of relief. A monstrous, guilty relief that made her despise herself. Because her little, helpless Izuku, her son, wanted to explore a world full of villains, monsters, and natural disasters driven by quirks powerful enough to level buildings. He also had nothing. It was a death sentence in his dream. She shed tears for his suffering as well as the horrifying relief that perhaps, just possibly, this diagnosis would protect him. "I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry," she cried as she wrapped her arms around him. And Izuku was not reassured by that embrace. He had a sense of confirmation. The world of heroes was no longer open. And the person who loved him the most, his mother, was too afraid to even attempt opening a window. It wasn't a daily tragedy in the years that followed. They were death from 1,000 minor, everyday wounds. The world was indifferent, which was far worse than intentionally cruel. Teachers read his file at school. Midoriya, Izuku. Quirk. None. They quickly glanced over him. He didn't require attention because he wasn't an issue. He didn't deserve investment because he wasn't a guarantee. In the classroom, he was just a blank space. Katsuki Bakugo represented the opposing viewpoint. His quirk was strong, explosive, and designed for battle. Teachers saw the clay of a future great hero in him. His intimidation and taunts, "Deku, the helpless one," were downplayed. They remarked, "He's just spirited, boys will be boys. He's showing leadership skills." Izuku picked things up fast. He discovered that justice depended on the situation. Bakugo received a light warning if a teacher witnessed him using his explosions to frighten another child. The reasoning was straightforward. Bakugo's quirk was valuable, and if that same child, whose quirk allowed him to bounce objects, threw a pencil back at Bakugo, he was punished for irresponsible quirk usage. None of the other children did. Izuku's was non-existent. The hierarchy was obvious. Izuku watched and examined. His well-known notebooks, Hero Analysis for the Future, began as a devotional exercise, a means of holding onto a dying dream. However, their nature evolved over time. He wrote about more than just Endeavor's support equipment or All Might's special moves. He began making other notes. The Kiyoshi Shopping District Incident. Kamui Woods, the hero. Thief with an arm-only gigantification quirk is the villain. Result. The villain is captured. Collateral damage. Lacquered chain prison. Dented the roof of a car, destroyed a fruit stand, and broke 3 storefronts. Observation. 2 purses were taken by the villain. The damage was far more expensive than the theft. As Kamui Woods was interviewed by reporters, the elderly proprietor of the fruit stand broke down in tears. The vendor was not interviewed. The incident. Battle close to the train station. Hero. Arms of Death. The antagonist is a woman with a mild acid-spitting quirk. Incident. An inebriated woman spit acid on the ground in rage after arguing with her partner. In response, Death Arms almost dislocated her shoulder by pinning her in a joint lock. According to the media, it was firm and decisive. Observation. A woman yelled that she was fired. She wasn't a threat, she was desperate. Without resorting to violence, a trained officer could have diffused the situation. Is that the type of training heroes receive? Or do they just pick up punching? Izuku started to view the world as a flawed, intricate ecosystem rather than a stage for heroes and villains. The ostentatious solution, the one that looked good on film, was heroes. All too frequently, however, they were hammers who saw everything as nails. They left behind quieter, smaller issues that no one bothered to fix. He began his physical training pitifully. He attempted to imitate karate katas he found online when he was 10 years old, motivated by a documentary about pre-quirk martial artists. He did them in his bedroom, almost shattering his lamp and tripping over his carpet. Within 2 minutes, he was out of breath, his heart thumping painfully, and he was sweating profusely. It was embarrassing how weak his body was. But he wasn't paralyzed by frustration this time. It turned into slow-burning, cold fuel. He didn't try the katas the following day. After tying his shoes, he started running. Before his lungs burned and he had to stop, gasping. He had only made it 3 blocks. He was viewed with sympathy by a man walking his poodle, whose quirk caused it to change color according to emotion, currently curious blue. Izuku chose to ignore it. He stood up straight and went home. He ran 3.5 blocks the following day. It was not some great battle that marked the turning point. It wasn't the UA or the sludge villain. Entrance examination. There were storms in the distance. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon with light rain that marked a turning point. Izuku, 12, was making his way home down a small alley that smelled like rancid noodles and wet trash. He witnessed a first-year student being cornered by 3 older boys. They did not attend his school. The kid in the corner was small, had thick glasses, and had a quirk that was obviously useless. His ears twitched like a rabbit's, but were now folded back in fear. The bullies lacked ostentatious quirks. One's fingernails could grow half a centimeter more quickly than usual. Someone else might alter the color of his eyes. Almost as useless as Deku, they were. However, they were only 3. Larger. And they only required that power. The leader yelled, "Lunch money, bunny ears," and pushed the child against the brick wall. Izuku stopped. In his ears, his heart roared. In his backpack, his notebook, volume 9, felt like a slab of lead. In it, he had dissected Eraserhead's strategy, a hero who fought without using physical force. He had hypothesized the use of blind spots, environmental leverage, and capture gear. Hypothesis. The leader exudes too much confidence. He takes an open position. The bunny kid might have an opportunity to flee if there is a distraction from the alley entrance. To my right is a trash can. I could force it to produce sound. My name is Izuku Midoriya, 150 centimeters in height, 45 pounds. When I attempt to yell, my voice falters. I'll be next if they see me. After stealing some cash from the child's wallet, the bullies threw it into a puddle. They chuckled. After saying, "Don't tell anyone, rabbit, or tomorrow will be worse," they gave each other high fives and left. After standing there trembling, the child picked up his dripping wallet and fled while crying. Izuku was still standing. He remained invisible, unhelpful, and hidden, a specter. He knew. He had done some analysis. In those 10 seconds, he had envisioned a dozen different situations. His body, however, had not reacted. He was nailed to the ground by fear. He moved forward slowly. The filthy puddle was reduced to ripples. And something inside of him hardened in that instant, under the chilly drizzle, rather than breaking. Solidified at the bottom of his stomach into a heavy, cold piece. Thousands were saved by All Might's smile. However, he hadn't visited that alley. Kamui Woods defeated giant villains, but he showed no concern for 3 bullies who were teenagers. The true kind of justice wasn't always accompanied by a loud laugh and a cape. It didn't always come at all. Furthermore, the world didn't wait for the wounded to mend. Either you got left behind or you moved with your broken pieces. Izuku didn't open his hero analysis notebook that evening. Instead of searching for All Might debut, he typed the following when he turned on his old desktop. Beginner's calisthenics, which martial art works best for people who lack strength. Judo. Aikido. Leverage principles. Human anatomy. Points of pressure. Areas that are susceptible. With its triumphant pose and radiant smile, the All Might figure on his shelf appeared to be staring at him from the other side of the room. Izuku did not look back with admiration for the first time. He gazed with the icy resolve of someone who had just been taught a very bad lesson. In the shadowy corners of the world, if you want justice, you're eager for a hero. It takes thousands of hammer blows to forge iron, not just one, with pressure, heat, and a patience so draining that it verges on insanity. Under the apathetic eye of the moon, Izuku Midoriya discovered that lesson not in a forge but on the chilly asphalt of his neighborhood and the dusty park floor at dusk. The stifling silence before dawn marked the start of his new regimen. The smell of dew-soaked asphalt and the subtle aroma of bread starting to bake a few blocks away filled the cool, humid air. Izuku was tying his shoes before the first ray of sunlight even touched the rooftops, before his mother's alarm clock sounded. He could feel every crack in the sidewalk through the worn soles of these inexpensive shoes. It was a private hell during the first few weeks. Each exhalation was a strangled whimper, and each inhalation was a gulp of harsh air that never felt like enough. His lungs were like 2 burning bags. Unaccustomed to this kind of punishment, his legs protested with every step, and after just a few blocks, he turned to lead. The world shrank into a symphony of pain. The voice in his head, a siren of weakness pleading with him to stop. The metallic, bitter taste of exhaustion in the back of his throat, and the pounding of his heart in his ears, so loud it drowned out the sound of his feet on the pavement. He did it more than once. His body trembled with uncontrollable spasms and he was covered in cold sweat that made him shiver despite the exertion, and he collapsed in an alley, vomiting what little was left in his stomach. He pondered what in the world he was doing while curled up against a cold brick wall. This was not a brave act. It was pitiful. In the dark, a child punishes himself. However, he would close his eyes and the image would reappear, cruel and vivid. The bully's laughter, the elementary school child's terrified face, and his own humiliating paralysis at the alley's mouth. That memory was a ghost running next to him, a resolute foreman shouting that while pain was fleeting, helplessness could last a lifetime. As a result, he would get up, his legs shaking, and limp home, only to do it again the following day. And the subsequent one. It changed, but the pain remained. It turned into background noise, indicating that he was overdoing it. The gasps of agony became rhythmic. Long a stranger, defined only by its limitations, his body started to listen. It was a new language acquired through suffering, hard work, and a tiny, nearly indiscernible reward. 10 seconds less, 1 more block. In contrast, school was a psychological battleground. A place where he was forced to wear the useless mask of Deku. Bakugo, whose senses were as keen as his fiery temper, saw the shift almost instantly. Izuku stopped cowering. He didn't complain. He was now quiet. That confusion soon turned to anger as he took in the shoves and insults with a stony stillness that unnerved Bakugo. It was similar to slamming into a silent pillow. One day Bakugo cornered Deku against the lockers in the hallway and growled, "What's wrong with you, Deku? A villain eat your tongue?" Izuku's nose was irritated by Bakugo's signature sweat, which smelled of burnt sugar and ozone. Small, menacing sparks flickered in Bakugo's hands. Other pupils withdrew, creating a circle of quiet onlookers. In anticipation of impact, the elderly Izuku would have closed his eyes. They had to remain open due to the new Izuku. His mind, a muscle he had been training continuously, came to life. Analysis. Bakugo's posture. Aggressive, unbalanced, with weight on the front leg. Not fists, but open palms. Not to strike, but to threaten. Setting. School corridor, several observers. Risk of a quirk attack. Minimal. Suspension would result. Verbal humiliation is the goal. De-escalation and extraction are my goals. No, Kachan, he uttered, and his own voice sounded odd, devoid of its typical quiver. It was empty and flat. It was like a wrench thrown into Bakugo's aggression when he used his old nickname without the slightest fear. His expression briefly changed to one of surprise. All Izuku needed was that. He refrained from pushing. He made no attempt to challenge. He just broke the cornering with a sidestep and left down the corridor. He could feel the weight of everyone else watching and Bakugo's eyes burning into his back. It was not a sense of triumph. It had the feel of survival. He stuffed his fists in his pockets to quell the tremors of adrenaline once he was safely inside the classroom. His true education happened in places people had forgotten, far away from all of that. The dream of a real dojo was unattainable. He thus turned into a knowledge thief. His arsenal consisted of the public library. Hunched over in paranoia, he sat at public terminals as though he were accessing data that was prohibited. He downloaded old manuals on basic boxing, judo, and aikido. Books with black and white pictures of men in awkward poses and shaky diagrams. His dojo was a deserted clearing by the river, obscured by the pillar of an old bridge and weeping willows. There was gravel and compacted dirt on the ground. The scents of river plants, moisture, and the subtle odor of trash in the distance were all present. He trained there, night after night, in the orange glow of the city or the moonlight. Gravity was his first foe. The art of falling is called ukemi. His initial falls were terrible. He felt dust in his mouth, scrapes burned on his elbows and shoulders, and dull thuds that made him lose his breath. But he gained knowledge with every hit. He developed the ability to roll, to release energy, to transform his body from a bag of bones into a sphere. Throws against phantom opponents followed. He stumbled over his own feet, spinning and tugging at the air, feeling like a fool. His only dancing partner was his long, warped shadow, but he pictured it in his mind. Bakugo, he saw the bullies. Felt the pull of a fictitious lapel, the unbalanced presence of an absent body, and the pivotal hip turn to utilize the weight of the other. Naj ippon seoi. Goshi o barai daashi. Through hundreds and thousands of erroneous repetitions, he etched the patterns into his nervous system by murmuring the names like spells. Inko, his mother, was a person who lived in a state of controlled anxiety. As if he hadn't eaten in days, she watched her son gobble up dinner. He tried to cover up the dark bruises on his arms and legs with long sleeves, but she could see them. She discovered him dozing off while reading anatomy books with pages labeled with pressure points and muscle systems. Her mother's heart was screaming that something was wrong, that her son was fighting, that he was being harmed by the world. She lost her composure one evening when she was serving dinner. With her hands twisting the edge of her apron, she said, "Izuku, honey? Is something going on at school? You can tell me anything." Izuku raised his head from his bowl of rice. He could see the real fear in her eyes, the same fear she had displayed on the day of her diagnosis. He detested hurting her like that. Dreaded the lie he was going to say. As he said, "I'm fine, Mom," really, the lie was difficult for him to swallow. "I just joined an athletics club. It's demanding." He watched her loosen up a little. Her nerves were soothed by the thought of a club, something normal and structured. She held on to the explanation even though she didn't believe it completely. Compared to the horrifying alternative, it was simpler. Izuku also made changes to his notebooks. The project, Hero Analysis for the Future, was put on hold. The new ones were in labeled, hardcover. The city unfolded inside. With the wind blowing across his face, he sat on the rooftop of his building and drew. The Kiyoshi Shopping District, 6 p.m. on Thursday. On patrol is Hero Mount Lady. 4 of the 7 alleys are inaccessible due to her size. It took the police 6 minutes and 28 seconds to respond to a silent alarm at the jewelry store. Behind the newspaper kiosk, there is a blind spot in the camera on the southeast corner. The fire escape in the office building has just been painted and appears to be reliable, untested. He was becoming familiar with every piece, every way out, and every shadow on the game board. It was during a night of heavy rain that the realization occurred. His secret clearing turned into a mud pit as sheets of water fell from a black sky. Even though he was completely soaked, the rain completely blocked out his noise, giving him complete seclusion. His supporting foot slipped into dangerous mud while he was practicing a tai sabaki, or fast turn. Time slowed. The world seemed to be tilting at an impossible angle, and he felt a loss of balance and a chilling panic in his stomach. The earth rushed in his direction. His body was overcome by instinct, which had been developed over innumerable practice hours. He tucked his chin without thinking, let out a sharp breath, and slapped his palm on the floor. He performed a clumsy but successful ukemi, rolling his body over his shoulder. With a splash of mud, he fell onto his back, knocking the wind out of him. He lay there still, the taste of water and earth in his mouth, the cold rain pelting his face. The pain wasn't sharp, it was dull, and a crystalline clarity pierced through him in that misery. He was down. The move had failed him. He was unharmed, though. He had responded. Finally, without conscious thought telling it to, his body had done what it had been taught. Mud dripping from him like a creature born of the earth itself, he rose slowly to his feet. There was no cheering. No hand on his shoulder from a mentor. Just the rain. Izuku Midoriya, however, felt a genuine spark of fire within herself, alone in that dark clearing. Power wasn't the issue. It wasn't a quirk. It was skill. It was unquestionable evidence that his will, after thousands of silent repetitions, was finally transforming his body into a non-broken entity. It was an evolving weapon. It served as a base, and he promised himself that he would construct an arsenal on it. Empty promises and good fortune are not the foundation of an arsenal. It is made from the ruthless determination of someone who has nothing but their own will, the guile of necessity, and the icy edge of desperation. Through the bitter sweat of his early mornings, the lingering burn in his muscles, and the almost solemn silence of the nights he spent learning about the world outside the bright lights of heroes, Izuku Midoriya was learning this. It was time to equip the fortress and raise the walls if his body served as a foundation, as demonstrated by the violent fall in the muddy clearing. His entire being cried out for effectiveness and the capacity to take action. Calisthenics became as natural as breathing, a daily routine. He did push-ups, squats that made his knees pop, and pull-ups that made his palms scrape the chilly park bar. He silently prayed for the strength he sorely needed with each repetition and set that was pushed to its limit. The big, beautiful muscles of battle heroes, those figures carved out of stone, were not what he was after. He sought the unwavering endurance of a marathon runner, the controlled explosiveness of a cheetah, and feline agility. His muscles, which were previously weak and barely noticeable, became more defined beneath his skin. Now his body was a lean, surprisingly efficient machine, lighter and faster. Every tendon and fiber was palpable to him. It was a map of suffering and development. He began his morning runs with gasping and vomiting, and they grew longer and longer, reaching distances that used to seem like fever dreams. He no longer fled that alley to avoid embarrassment or to stifle the specter of his frozen self. He now ran to become proficient with the terrain and to experience the unrelenting rhythm of the city beneath his beat-up sneakers. He developed a discipline that verged on obsession as he learned to regulate his breathing and pay attention to his body's subtle cues, such as the burn in his thighs and the stitch in his side, in order to push past exhaustion. An additional brick in the wall of his new identity, each new kilometer was a tiny victory. His classroom, his haven of knowledge, was still the public library, with its smell of old paper and the gentle rustle of pages. However, his research grew significantly. His silent manuals on judo and aikido, which taught him how to fall and throw, were no longer sufficient. Now his attention was on unconventional subjects. He studied the principles of leverage, human movement biomechanics, impact physics and energy transfer, and tool ergonomics. He downloaded PDFs on everything from basic electrical diagrams for batteries and capacitors to climbing knot guides and basic trauma first aid. Once preoccupied with the painstaking examination of quirks and hero gear, his mind ate up this new information with ravenous fervor, looking for connections, patterns, and useful applications that no one else seemed to notice. Every tidbit of knowledge was a puzzle piece that he would not overlook. He discovered the first real spark of his arsenal in one of these books, a seemingly harmless survival manual, maybe written for hikers or doomsday preppers, in a chapter on making improvised tools, which explained how to transform commonplace items into practical ones in an emergency. He focused on a section about leverage and force transfer in impact because his eyes were trained to scan details. A reinforced umbrella might be more than just a rain shelter, and a big screwdriver might be more than just a screwdriver. Ingenuity as his own quirk was the dark, exciting seed that sowed itself into his mind. As of yet, firearms were still a hazy boundary that he dared not cross. Although his morals were twisted and hardened by experience and disillusionment in a world that was uncaring, he still clung to the idea of justice, not reckless destruction. He had studied them, yes, even how to alter airsoft replicas. The tools were different. The playing field was leveled by tools. Instead of relying on physical force, they were an extension of his intelligence. His little bedroom served as his makeshift lab when his mother Inko slept, or thought he did. The creak of the door was a tiny act of defiance as Izuku locked himself in. His reading lamp was focused on a corner of his desk, surrounded by items he had found at flea markets, scrounged from trash, or purchased with the few yen he had saved from his allowance or odd jobs at the convenience store. The first, upgraded, item was a pair of old, worn-out gardening gloves that were strengthened with small, hard plastic plates cut from a broken toy and high-strength duct tape. The idea was straightforward. Concentrate the force of a blow, protect his knuckles, and maximize the effectiveness of each strike. They became his first rudimentary, impact gloves. They provided no protection against quirks. From simple eye protection to what he envisioned as night vision, a pair of inexpensive safety goggles tinted with marker and equipped with makeshift elastic straps only offered a slightly greener, darker view of the outside world for the time being. An improvised baton was his first real weapon, if that term could be used without a mixture of embarrassment and enthusiasm. Fortunately discovered at an abandoned construction site, a 50-centimeter length of PVC pipe was carefully wrapped in layers of black electrical tape for grip and to conceal its source. It was filled with sand for weight. In his hand, it felt ominously real despite being heavy and crude. Feeling the inertia, the weight distribution, and the potential, he swung it in the air in his room while practicing basic movements he had seen in disarm and baton defense videos. Wrapped in an old t-shirt, he concealed it beneath his bed, a hard, cold secret that throbbed with the promise of action. Once full of theories, his urban studies notebooks now bled with the realities of the city. Izuku lived maps, not just drew them. He rode a bike, walked, and even took a train to explore different districts. He took in every sound, smell, and detail. The changing patterns of light and shadow at different times, store closing times, rooftop access points, old but sturdy fire escapes, wall cracks, and sewers big enough to crawl through are all examples of this, in addition to police patrol routes and hero response times. He started listing hotspots, such as bus stops abandoned after midnight, dimly lit parks where couples were harassed, and alleys where trash accumulated and turned into hiding places for vagrants or small-time criminals. Heroes rarely set foot in these places, with their epic battles and television cameras. He thought bitterly that justice rarely cared about small-time offenses. One day, from the relative safety of a nearby rooftop, he was watching a busy train station when he noticed something. Not a bad guy with a terrible quirk. A middle-aged businessman was being harassed by a group of older teenagers wearing uniforms from a rival school that he recognized from the embroidered emblem. Other than threatening glares and shoves, there were no quirks involved, and it wasn't an armed robbery. Just the implied threat of violence and ruthless laughter. At last, the man gave up his wallet with trembling hands, obviously intimidated. Nobody stepped in. People in the area turned away and sped up. On the street below, a strong hero with a strength quirk was giggling with a reporter about his most recent accomplishment. Izuku experienced the same icy rage and powerlessness that had paralyzed him in his childhood alley. His throat filled with bile. However, something was different this time. He remained motionless. Trained in quick analysis and risk assessment, his mind worked like a sophisticated algorithm. 20 meters is the distance. Low visibility from the main street makes it ideal for covert intervention. Thugs. 3. Open stances, overconfidence, and no discernible quirks. Victim. Fearful, unable to fight back. Except for the modified gardening gloves in my backpack, I don't have any equipment on me. At home is my baton. High risk. He took no action. He wasn't a moron. He was aware that he couldn't take them just yet. But he became more perceptive. With almost obsessive accuracy, he recorded every detail, including the thugs' movements, their clear vulnerabilities, and their diversions. The precise location of the closest security camera, pointing at the main entrance of the station, useless. The closest emergency exit. The way out for the man. Izuku didn't sleep that night. He mentally reenacted the event repeatedly, as if it were a realistic combat simulation. If he had been present, what would he have done with his baton and his abilities? How could he have stepped in without dying? What if his weapon was more potent? Would his PVC baton suffice? His thoughts drifted to human anatomy, pressure points, and police disarming videos. Can I make a difference, even a small one, even if it's invisible, without becoming another victim? Was the question he kept asking himself in the dark of his room while everyone else slept, oblivious to his inner struggles. It was a weighty and dangerous question. He was aware that the solution lay only in the most obscure and darkest areas of the city, where only shadows could move unseen and the bright lights of heroes could not reach. He was going to take his first steps on a lonely path. He didn't go for his daily morning run the following day. He went to the Kiyoshi district instead, to locate the alleys he had catalogued, the blind spots he had sketched, and to feel the ground beneath his feet. Not to look at Mount Lady or Kamui Woods. He followed the patrol routes he had studied, pausing at each turn to assess and measure. An odd combination of visceral fear and euphoric excitement made his heart race. The world didn't define heroism that way. Something more visceral, more primordial. The promise of action was what it was. He had never stepped onto his game board with the intention of making a mark before. The nights of Izuku Midoriya had changed. They were no longer limited to exhausting solo training sessions or hours of frantic study sessions. They were now explorations, silent plunges into the city's nighttime core. A strange adrenaline that, for the first time, made him feel fully alive was mixed with fear, which was still there all the time and felt like a cold bite in his stomach. Like a hunter pursuing his quarry. His uniform was simple. A cap to cover his untidy green hair, soft-soled sneakers for silent walking, and loose, dark clothes to camouflage his silhouette. With his homemade impact gloves and a cloth-wrapped PVC baton to reduce noise, he carried a lightweight backpack. Everything was planned, including the use of energy bars and water to keep you hydrated and unscented deodorant to leave no trace. He wasn't a hero. He was not seeking out direct conflict. He looked for shadows, efficiency, and secrecy. His initial patrols were circumspect. He navigated through alleys he had previously charted, paying attention to security camera blind spots and learning the sounds, textures, and scents of the city night. The incessant hum of air conditioners, the foul stench of trash cans, and the oily smell of a late-night eatery. He could hear a dog barking, the echo of a siren, and the laughter of passers-by in the distance. As a relentless processor, his mind took in every detail, analyzing patterns and determining threats. He intensified his physical training even further. He climbed instead of just running. Pulling himself up with his arm and back muscles, he hung from the bars in the park. He worked on estimating distance and angle, practicing leaping between benches, and visualizing a chase or escape. He honed his ukemi in the riverside clearing until his falls were quiet and fluid. Even though he had no actual opponent, his throws became more automatic. Even though it was still far from perfect, his body was now a finely tuned instrument that reflected his will. The silence fell one night as we were strolling through an older business district that was well known for its bars and less traveled streets after midnight. A desperate, muffled scream. Before doubt could take hold, instinct took over. Even he was surprised by how fluidly he moved, slipping between accumulating shadows while his heart pounded like a war drum and his breathing was regulated. The noise had originated in a dim, small alley. A young woman had been cornered against a graffiti-covered wall by two drunken men who were shouting. With gruff, threat-filled voices, one was pushing her while the other was yanking at her bag. The scene felt even more macabre because of the dancing shadows created by the nearby neon signs' flickering light. In the dark, Izuku came to a halt at the alley's entrance. His thoughts were racing. Two assailants. Slow, but unpredictable, drunk. The girl refused to defend herself because she was afraid. No heroes in the area. It would take too long to call the police. I have been preparing for this. In his hand, the PVC baton felt surprisingly light. It was either now or never. He recalled his own paralysis and the phrases he had seen in judo manuals. Off balance, use the opponent's strength. Not anymore. He took a deep breath, a silent mantra against the fear. Move, Izuku. Just move. His initial move was one of distraction rather than confrontation. Using the strength he had gained, he threw a small piece of brick he had previously picked up at a metal garbage can at the end of the alley rather than at them directly. The clang reverberated, heightened by the confined area. Startled, both men turned, their inebriated heads swaying. What the hell was that? Yelled one, preoccupied. His opening was that. Izuku lunged forward. It was with the measured, practiced speed he had developed, not Bakugo's rage. His intention was to disable and disorient them, not to knock them out. The man with the girl's bag was closer, and he lunged at him. He didn't attempt a full throw, instead using a move that was inspired by innumerable Ippon Seo Inage drills. Rather, he off-balanced himself using the principle of the technique. He twisted his hips and pushed the man firmly against the alley wall after slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. With a grunt, the man let go of the bag, which thudded loudly against the wall before collapsing to the floor. Stunned by the ghostly speed, the second man stumbled. A quirk? He's a hero. Izuku remained silent. He was already turning, making use of the first hit's inertia. He felt secure in his homemade gloves. He hit the second man, aiming for the solar plexus, a soft spot he had researched. It was precision rather than force. The man rolled over in agony as the air was forced out of his lungs, causing him to gasp. Curled against the wall, the young woman gazed at him with wide eyes, a mixture of amazement and fear. Izuku hissed, Run, in a low, raspy voice that was distorted by the adrenaline. He wished to avoid recognition. She accepted without waiting for another invitation. Her footsteps soon faded away as she snatched up her bag and ran out of the alley. Izuku left. The men were beginning to feel better. One was rubbing his head and moaning. The other was coughing and slowly rising again. To a hero, they posed no threat, but to a naive teenager, it would be suicide to keep fighting. With the same fluid grace that had brought him here, he turned and vanished into the night. His heart continued to race, but it was no longer only fear. It was the excitement of action, the realization that all of his preparation had paid off. A few blocks away, he paused and leaned against the chilly wall of a building, hidden in its shadow. His muscles shook from the adrenaline rush as well as from exertion. He had stepped in. He had changed things. No cameras. No cheers. No acknowledgement. Nothing but the silence of the night. One important realization came to him as he calmed down. He hadn't even used the baton. His quick thinking, his training, and his body had been sufficient. It was a strong idea. His true weapons were his physicality, his wit, and his environmental awareness. The image of All Might in his mind seemed farther away than ever as he traveled home under a sky that was only starting to lighten with the first signs of dawn. The symbol of peace's bright smile was reserved for large crowds and catastrophic events. But something else was required in shadowy alleys and forgotten nooks where justice was seldom served. A specter. And Izuku Midoriya had united that night. For the first time, he had experienced the weight of accountability as well as the weight of efficacy. He wouldn't think twice the next time. He wouldn't be empty the next time. At dawn, the excitement of the previous evening remained, the icy glimmer of victory Izuku had experienced as he vanished into the alley's darkness. It was a more profound, almost solemn, sense of fulfillment rather than the joyous pride of a child who had performed a trick. He had taken action. He had worked. Although fear persisted, it was now accompanied by a conviction that was more powerful than any fear. He was now involved in the gloomy underbelly of the city, not merely an observer. It was a silent ritual when he got home. With the same quiet precision, he slipped through the front door before Inko woke up, put his backpack down, peeled off his dark clothes, and buried them deep in the laundry basket, ready to be hand-washed without being noticed. The image of a teenager with sleep-deprived eyes was reflected in the bathroom mirror, but there was a new glint, a hardening that had not been there before. His right knuckle was scraped, a memento of his first fight. It didn't hurt. With an almost scientific curiosity, he examined it as if it were evidence for a theory. Breakfast with Inko that morning was a delicate dance of pretense. Izuku, who is typically a tornado of anxious energy and scrawls from notebooks, moved with a strange composure. Using her maternal intuition, Inko saw the shift. The way his body retained tension even when relaxed, the way his eyes lingered on her, analyzing. As she served his miso soup, she inquired softly, "Did you sleep okay, Izuku?" She was constantly worried and trying to break through the barrier that surrounded her son. Izuku sipped his tea, enjoying the unique sensation of the burn on his tongue. "Yeah, Mom. I was just thinking about track club. We need to improve our times." Now the lie came more naturally, a tool that was required. Lying to her was painful, but she wouldn't get it. She was unable to comprehend the alley, the fear, or the need to change. He couldn't afford that distraction, and her anxiety would only increase. Although Inko's brow was slightly furrowed with lingering doubt, she nodded and clung to his response like a storm's anchor. "That's good, sweetie. It's always good to have goals. Just don't overdo it, okay? I don't want you getting hurt." The faint red mark on his neck, a friction burn from the abrupt shove against the alley wall, briefly caught her attention. The look lingered, a silent question hanging in the air, but she said nothing. Izuku's gaze lowered to his plate. That day, school seemed even farther away, almost unimportant. The hum of classes was dull. His thoughts remained in the alley, going over the entire night in his head and dissecting every second. The thrown brick works well. The wall shove was passable but ineffective. The solar plexus strike is precise but incomplete. I require more authority, more skill. As usual, Bakugo made one think of battle. In a straightforward act of dominance, the explosive blonde pushed him without hesitation as she passed him in the hallway. Izuku faltered but did not tumble. Now stronger, his body took the blow surprisingly well. Bakugo glared, his eyes blazing with contempt. "Out of my way, Deku, damn extra," he said. Izuku just gave him an unreadable look. He had a chilly evaluation in his eyes instead of fear. Too foreseeable. He uses intimidation and explosions. He has a strong position, but his weakness is his temper. He remained silent. Simply moved aside. That denial of Bakugo's strength and that silence irritated him. After a moment of confusion, Bakugo scoffed and hurried away. Izuku, however, saw the annoyance in his stiff shoulders. A minor but significant victory. His training intensified that afternoon, driven by hunger as much as necessity. To improve the force and velocity of his blows, he jumped right into plyometrics, which are explosive exercises. Every leap and movement was an attempt to find the edge that was missing. His practice of Aikido and Judo in the park clearing intensified. He didn't just practice breakfalls anymore, he integrated them into imagined combinations. Ukemi served as a tool for immediate recovery and ground-based counterattack in addition to injury prevention. Even if his opponent was only a mental image, he spent hours perfecting his throws and learning how to use their weight against them. Visualization turned into a tool. He practiced every situation, including shifting weight, resistance, and counterattacks. His clothes were soaked with sweat. Mud stuck to his body. However, he continued until his mind was as worn out as his muscles. He became more systematic in his search for better tools. Despite its effectiveness, the PVC baton was too large to be used covertly. He required a multi-purpose item. His inspiration came from the library. He studied non-lethal subjugation, pressure point tools, and undetectable materials. He discovered ideas that supported his theory of leveraging disadvantage on obscure online forums that he accessed via virtual private networks and dark corners of the internet. In certain nations, police officers employed knuckle keys or kubotans, which are small, covert devices that magnified hand strikes without using deadly force. He purchased a piece of high-density acrylic resin from an art supply store using his savings. He started carving using tools he borrowed from his father's old toolbox. It was tedious and slow. At first, his fingers were awkward, but his determination was unwavering. The sweet smell of cut plastic filled the air as hours passed under his desk lamp. At last, it appeared. Roughly 15 centimeters long, blunt-tipped, and finger-grooved. Not deadly, but it would be a potent force multiplier in Izuku's hands given his understanding of pressure points. The pinnacle is the name he gave it, his very first real tool. There was much more in his notebooks than route maps, which are now stored in a secret section of his backpack. They maintained nightlife patterns, such as which buildings provided roof access for surveillance, which alleys intoxicated office workers used as shortcuts, and where small-time criminals congregated. He recognized the city's gray zones, areas with little hero presence and sluggish police response. Locations where minor evils flourished without the symbol of peace noticing. Instinct summoned him once more a week after his initial intervention. The night was overcast, and the air was heavy with the threat of rain. Izuku waited where he usually does, on a low rooftop with a view of a bar district. The pinnacle was a quiet, reassuring presence in the inside pocket of his jacket. His mind was sharp, his breath steady, his ears tuned to every sound as he scanned the streets. Muffled voices rose below. A woman and two men stumbled out of a bar and got into a fight. The woman attempted to leave, obviously upset. She was roughly grabbed by one man. The voices became more piercing. She was pushed into a wall by the second man, directly below Izuku's perch. His heart pounded, but this time the panic was brief. The rush of adrenaline was not new. Nearly welcome. 3 assailants. Not 2. However, being intoxicated is a benefit. The woman is in danger. The pinnacle is what he drew. In his hand, the resin felt smooth and cold. This time, there's no hesitation. There was fear, but it was overshadowed by an obvious and unadulterated need. Silently, he fell from the roof into the shadow of the alley. Silently, it moved. The men were too preoccupied to pay attention. He focused on the man who was holding the woman. He had to be quick and accurate because he couldn't risk a drawn-out battle. He remembered every anatomical weakness, every pressure point. He slid behind the assailant in one smooth motion. With the pinnacle in hand, he struck the base of the neck, directly behind the ear. Just enough to stun, but not a knockout. Muscles locking involuntarily, the man let out a cry. Both the woman and the second man turned in surprise. What the hell? The inebriated man yelled, his eyes glassy. Izuku prevented them from responding. He struck the inner thigh's femoral nerve with a lunge at the second man. A quick, clean hit. The man clutched his leg and crumpled, moaning in agony. Through her tears, the woman gazed at Izuku, bewildered and in wonder. He prevented her from speaking. His voice was sharp and low as he hissed, "Run, now." As the first drops of rain started to fall, She nodded and ran, heels clacking on the wet asphalt. Izuku left. The men were getting better. One was rubbing his head and swearing. The other had a hard time standing. For a professional hero, they posed no threat, but for an eccentric teen, staying would mean death. As smoothly as he had come, he disappeared into the darkness. His heart pounded, not just from fear, but also from the excitement of doing something. An affirmation that his training was important. He was slumped against a wall a few blocks away, his body shaking from adrenaline and effort. He had changed things. No cameras. No cheers. No acknowledgement. Only the silence of the night. And again, the baton had not been used by him. His physical attributes, training, and keen intellect had sufficed. He gained strength from that thought. His real weapons were his strength, his intelligence, and his awareness of his surroundings. All Might's image seemed farther away than ever as he made his way home under a night that was gradually giving way to the pale light of dawn. The symbol of peace's radiant grin was reserved for disasters and crowds. However, something else was required in the shadows and forgotten nooks. A specter. And Izuku Midoriya had been one tonight. For the first time, he had experienced the weight of accountability and genuine efficacy. Izuku's increasing self-assurance felt like a double-edged sword the next week. He was driven to look for more locations, more circumstances, and a deeper dive into the intricate web of the city. By the assurance that he could take action. He was drawn to the gray zones that he had marked on his maps. He desired to put himself to the test, to continue. The wind howled coldly between buildings in a semi-desolate industrial district on a Tuesday night. It was either the danger or the opportunity. Izuku had picked the location because of the dim lighting and lack of hero presence. An ideal setting for operating covertly. He heard something strange as he walked carefully between walls covered in graffiti and dilapidated warehouses. It was a dry, repetitive sound, not a victim's cry or shouting while intoxicated. A fist. A grunt. Then there was another blow. A dead-end alley between two factory buildings was the source of the noise. Izuku moved cautiously closer, his heart thumping like a war drum as he took silent steps. He glanced around the bend. He had never witnessed a scene so brutal. A large, cold-eyed man in his 30s was pinning a younger man against a dumpster. Izuku recognized the man's neck tattoo from local police reports. He was a small-time extortionist. This place was alcohol-free. He was clean, calculated. The slender and obviously frightened child covered his face as the savage swung clean, vicious blows at his stomach. "Where's my money, rat? Don't make me ask again." The blows weren't wild, they were precise, intended to injure and to threaten. Izuku's anxiety intensified. This was no drunken thug blundering about. It was a predatory man. An expert. Extortionist. No weapon in sight, but powerful physique. The victim is bigger than me, but he is powerless. I'm next if I intervene. Cool temperament, unlike Bakugo. More difficult to read. Fake out is more difficult. The pinnacle is what he drew. Suddenly, the little instrument felt very isolated in his grasp. The baton was too big and too slow to be of any use here. He required accuracy, quickness. In an attempt to quiet the siren of doubt blaring in his head, he inhaled deeply. Then he made a move. The same tactic, surprise and distraction. He threw a tiny stone at a nearby broken window. Sharp and loud, the shatter reverberated through the alley. At once the extortionist turned. His dark, piercing eyes were unclouded by alcohol. He was prepared. He growled, low and menacing, "Who's there?" That was the time. Izuku sprinted toward the solar plexus. In order to allow the victim to escape, he had to render them immobile. With the pinnacle poised, he leapt. The man wasn't slow, though. He was no stranger to fighting. He turned just enough when he saw the blur of movement in the darkness. Rather than striking center mass, Izuku's strike slid across his ribs. The man grunted in surprise rather than pain. A strong, quick hand caught Izuku by the collar before he could adjust. They lifted him straight off the ground. He was slammed into the dumpster by the man. The sound of metal echoed. Izuku's back exploded with pain. A clang echoed in his skull as his head cracked against steel. His vision was filled with stars. His mouth was filled with a metallic taste. The man hissed, his eyes shining with controlled rage. "So you're the little ghost," they said. He lifted a huge fist. Izuku had trouble. His brain cried out, "Act, Yukemi, toss, anything at all." However, the man had an iron grip. Everything was dulled by the ache in his back and the hum in his brain. This was no inebriated criminal. He was a fighter. When the younger victim saw his opportunity, he fled, didn't turn around. Izuku also experienced a brief moment of relief in spite of the pain, he fled. The fist dropped. Izuku's eyes closed. However, something inside of me suddenly snapped. Not authority. Not courage. Living. Unadulterated, instinctive speed. During the swing, he dropped his weight and curled as the grip briefly relaxed. Hissing past his ear, the punch missed. Izuku escaped, slamming into the ground with a spontaneous ukemi that cushioned the impact. He made no attempt to defend himself. He was unable to. Not against this man. Now his only tools are speed and familiarity with the terrain. He got up with a stutter. He had a throbbing headache. His mouth was full of blood. The man pivoted. Don't run, punk. Izuku, however, had already left. He did not flee for his life. Not toward major roads or streetlights. He plunged farther into the industrial labyrinth, down alleys and paths he had committed to memory. His body moving instinctively beneath a hanging pipe, over a rusted barrel. He heard heavy footsteps behind him. Get back here, you little shit. Izuku continued. His stamina held. Even though his legs burned and his lungs screamed, he was familiar with these streets. He took advantage of every blind spot and unexpected turn, each deep shadow. He could recall which alleys were dangerous, which ones provided a way out. The pursuit was silent. In the dark, a lethal dance. He finally arrived at a tall, rusted fence after what seemed like an eternity. There's a main street beyond it. Automobiles, lights, individuals. He climbed with a final burst of energy. Cold iron was grasped by fingers. He rolled on the other side after vaulting the top. He turned around. The extortionist, unable to climb quickly enough, stood on the other side, fuming. He couldn't chance being noticed. Izuku gasped and fell to his knees. Pain and adrenaline made his body tremble. His head thumped. His back hurt. A knot behind his skull was swollen. He had suffered a beating, overpowered, almost caught. The excitement of the week before had vanished, swapped out for a harsh lesson. He could deal with inebriated people. Thugs caught off guard, but he couldn't compete with someone who was sober, skilled, and cruel, someone who wasn't fooled. He had lost. He had lived, only because he took off running, since he was more familiar with the city. The harsh reality sank in as he hobbled home. It felt tiny in his pocket, the pinnacle. Even though his training was impressive for someone without a quirk, it was insufficient. Yes, he needed more power. But there's more tools. How to level the playing field when there was no way out. He required more than pressure points and fists. The broken weren't weighing for the world. Furthermore, he couldn't afford to break once more. A new, unadulterated demand was attached to the silent pledge he had made following this slap of pure humility, that he would serve as a guardian in the shadows. He must have grown more dangerous. Izuku was learning with a sour feeling in the pit of his stomach that confidence had two sides. It was a drug that whispered you could fly and pushed you to walk along the abyss's edge. He had pushed himself farther and farther into the gray zones of his painstakingly created maps because he was certain that he could take action and that his choices would actually affect the course of the night. These were the areas that the heroic light had forgotten, the city's capillary veins where injustice was a silent and persistent ailment. However, the humiliation inflicted by the sober extortionist had served as a harsh lesson and a chilly counterbalance to the feelings of euphoria. It was more than merely a memory. It was a profound, unseen scar that blazed with the icy ember of inadequacy. It was no longer enough to be quick or intelligent. He had to have more fortitude, more resilient, more hazardous. The journey home that night had been a quiet one. He had to negotiate the sharp pain in his ribs with every step. Like a thief, he had sneaked into his apartment, and every floor creak was a potential betrayal. There was no image of a rising vigilante reflected back at him in the harsh fluorescent light in front of the bathroom mirror. It was a battered boy's. His cheekbone started to develop a purplish bruise, which served as a visual reminder of his failure. There was no fighter in sight. Deku, the worthless one who always ended up on the ground, was there. The pitiful image in the mirror was the target of his anger, not the man who had struck him. A calculating and frigid fury. It wasn't winning to run away. It wasn't about surviving. His new forge was fueled by that anger. His training became a feverish obsession, a purposeful act of self-flagellation that went beyond discipline. Morning runs were now punishments rather than ways to stay in shape. Before the first ray of sunlight reached the rooftops, he threw himself through the streets, the cold air burning his lungs like acid. He ran through deserted industrial parks, over uneven ground, over rusty pipes, up low moss-covered walls, and practiced falls on the hard, unforgiving pavement until his hips and shoulders complained of a dull ache. The ability to absorb impact, to reduce pain to input data, and to continue moving was what he was looking for, not grace. His shadow, an unrelenting foe who was aware of all his vulnerabilities, turned into his sparring partner in the desolate clearing by the river. It was now a battle against himself rather than merely shadowboxing. He threw combinations until his muscles trembled on the edge of collapsing and his eyes became blinded by sweat. The change to a judo imbalance, a jab, a cross, and a hip twist to avoid a phantom counterattack. He repeatedly rehearsed the technique of falling with a ukemi and using the momentum to jump straight into an attack stance. Once brittle and formless, his body was hardening, each muscle tensing beneath the skin like a steel cable, an armor made of suffering and fatigue. His commitment was demonstrated by the network of tiny scars and calluses covering his knuckles. But frustration brought him back to his desk, his real battleground. This was his makeshift lab, in the memory of the savage force that had brought him down. The pinnacle, that tiny piece of resin, felt like a toy. He required equalizers. He required weapons that overrode his opponent's physical advantages and enforced his own regulations during a brawl. His one and only quirk, his analytical mind, probed the depths of simple electronics. He once studied the quirks of heroes with the same eagerness that he now devoured circuit diagrams and old appliance repair manuals. He started his pilgrimage through flea markets and used electronics stores with the meager yen he had saved from odd jobs. He purchased inexpensive parts, including meters of wire, a 9-volt battery, a crude switch, and capacitors from disposable cameras. His room changed. The old paper of his books blended with the smell of burnt tin from his clumsy soldering. Discarded parts and stripped wires littered the floor. He worked manically through entire nights, illuminated only by a desk lamp. He developed new dexterity in his fingers, which were frequently pricked by wires or burned by the soldering iron. The end product was an unsightly prototype made of electrical tape holding a black plastic block the size of a deck of cards together. Its surface was broken by a coarse red switch, and 2 nails stuck out from one end. With a sharp buzz and the distinct scent of ozone, an electric arc, a tiny, ferocious blue spark, jumped between the tips when it was activated. It wasn't a taser used by professionals. The high voltage, low amp discharge would be a painful surprise, an involuntary muscle contraction, and a window of opportunity, but it probably wouldn't knock a man down. It was an ugly, makeshift weapon used by a ghost, but it was created out of sheer need. He developed his irritant spray at the same time. He found that combining the strongest cayenne he could find with an oil base and a small amount of isopropyl alcohol produced a sticky, devilish solution. It would be difficult to dissipate in the air. It would stick to the eyes and the skin. With teary eyes and a burning throat, he tested it by spritzing a small amount on a rag in his room. The air became so caustic that he had to ventilate for an hour. It was a chemical panic button, an area denial weapon. Izuku was on patrol in a dilapidated industrial area on a windy night, the kind where the wind laments as it whistles between buildings. It was a maze of warehouses with broken windows that resembled empty eye sockets, a cemetery of rusted ambitions. The smell of rot and wet metal filled the air. Opportunity, or misfortune, came to light here, in this urban wasteland. It wasn't the wail of a terrified victim or the screams of intoxicated people. It was the sound of violence, dry, monotonous, and sickening. There was the dull thud of a body striking a container, a muffled moan, a punch. His heart pounded dully against his ribs as he moved closer, cautious as a predator. He caught a glimpse of the scene through the corner of a collapsing brick wall. 2 people were punishing a young man for a supposed debt. They could be identified as members of a local gang by the shoddy and inexpensive tattoos on their necks. The street was brutal, efficient, and devoid of any ostentatious quirks. The muscle was one, shaven-headed and burly. The speed and cruelty of the other, who was thinner and had an unsightly scar that split an eyebrow. Izuku's thoughts turned into a vortex of icy analysis. 2 assailants, in their territory, sober and vigilant. The victim won't help because they are afraid. The alley is a death trap, a funnel. Once he steps in, it's nearly impossible to get out. Risk. Serious. However, he was motivated by the extortionist's memory and his own powerlessness. There would be no retreat this time. He was ready for this. He needed to confront them. He needed to prevail. He removed a heavy metal nut from his pocket. Not even a stone. A manufactured item with a sharper, more discordant sound. A stack of rusty metal sheets was leaning against the wall at the back of the alley, and he threw it with a precise arc. In the relative quiet, the clang echoed loudly and strangely. "Who the hell's there?" snarled the muscular one, turning involuntarily to face the commotion as his muscles tensed. Izuku would only have a brief window of time for distraction, and through it he hurled himself. In a flash of dark movement, he charged. The thinner, scarred one, whom he had determined to be the faster threat, was his target. He intended to use a swift judo disarm, a move he had honed countless times against his shadow. However, a shadow doesn't strike back. Izuku was taken aback by the gang member's street speed reaction, which involved a filthy, sweeping kick to the groin and the yanking of his arm out of the grip before he could use the leverage. Izuku instinctively took a step back, sparing him from excruciating pain, but the kick struck his thigh hard enough to knock him off balance. He felt a chill go down his spine. The initiative was already gone from him. In the first second, the plan had fallen apart. With a low, animalistic growl instead of a shout, the muscular gang member lunged at him. He roared, "You picked the wrong place, Ghost," as his hammer-sized fist cut through the air with apparent force. With the wind of the blow whistling in his ear, Izuku ducked by millimeters. His senses were sharpened by adrenaline. He launched a counterattack with the pinnacle, hammering it into the man's floating ribs with all of his might. The thug grunted in surprise and pain, but he hardly moved. The impact was absorbed by his body mass like a bug bite. The scarred one lunged, delivering a barrage of malignant but ill-executed punches as the burly one briefly hunched over. Izuku's boxing training came out as he attempted to dodge and block, but the speed and intensity were too much for him. He saw a flash of white lights as a blow grazed his temple. The next struck him right in the jaw with a vicious upward hook. The world broke up. A white, pure, explosive pain exploded in his face. Like a church bell, the impact sound reverberated inside his skull. With the hot, metallic taste of his own blood in his mouth, he fell to his knees as the alley whirled violently. His palms dug into the gravel on the floor. "We got you, rat," the scarred one sneered, his face contorted by a ruthless grin as he lifted a boot to smash his face into the floor. An ocean of pain threatened to submerge him. An icy wave of panic yelled at him to curl up and concede. But underneath it all, the self-imposed torture, the training, reacted. Ukemi, the art of falling. Data is pain. Respond. Make use of his weight. Izuku didn't attempt to block the boot as it came down because he was so overcome with adrenaline. Rolling under the kick with a clumsy but effective movement, he lunged forward. He gripped the gang member's leg for support and used all the leverage he had learned with a violent twist of his own body and a desperate tug. The thug lost his balance and cried out sharply after being caught in mid-motion. With a wet, sickening thud, his head hit the concrete as he fell backward like a fallen tree. His eyes rolled back and he went limp. A victory. The large one, fully recovered from his shock and enraged, charged once more. Izuku stumbled to his feet, his jaw a throbbing mass of pain, his vision blurred in one eye, and the world still tilted. He was no longer able to trade blows. He required a competitive advantage. The irritant spray was in his pocket when his shaking hand found it. Right now, he quickly drew it out and squeezed the nozzle, sending a dense orange cloud directly into the face of the approaching assailant. A howl of sheer agony swiftly replaced the man's strangled cry of surprise as he came to a complete stop. His hands shot up to his eyes and began frantically rubbing. "My eyes. Damn it. What is this? It burns," he cried, staggering backward, blind and confused. Izuku didn't hold back. He had no intention of running. He had to put an end to this fight that was his. He took a step toward the writhing man and used his homemade taser with icy accuracy. Flipping the switch, he pressed the twin metal prongs against the thick neck. A guttural scream and the sound of sizzling flesh followed the electric buzz. The heavy-set man arched violently, his muscles tensing in uncontrollable spasms, then twitched weakly and fell to the ground like a sack of bricks. The ensuing quiet was nearly as loud as the altercation. Izuku stood in the center of the alley, trembling uncontrollably and gasping. The smell of blood, pepper, and ozone filled the air. He examined the two motionless bodies. The young man they had been attacking, who had watched the entire event from the alley entrance, frozen in place with his mouth open and his eyes wide with fear. Izuku hissed, "Get out of here," in a voice that was broken and hardly distinguishable. The boy blinked as if he had just woken up from a daze. His footsteps faded into echoes as he nodded frantically and disappeared into the night. Izuku left to enjoy the moment. He melted back into the darkness, limping, his body yelling in protest, each step a searing ache. A few blocks away, he paused and leaned against the damp, cold wall of an abandoned building, struggling to breathe as a wave of nausea swept through his throat. He spit a viscous mixture of blood and saliva onto the sidewalk. He was victorious. He had prevailed in a direct battle. He hadn't gotten away. However, the cost was ingrained in every part of him. The fact that he was still vulnerable struck him with the same force as the gang member's punch. He had depended on surprise, desperation, and his tools. If the spray had run out, if the taser had not worked. The triumphant euphoria faded as he hobbled home in the sickly, anonymous glow of the streetlights, leaving a bitter aftertaste. All of his scars, both visible and invisible, were lessons etched into his skin. He wasn't a happy hero who emerged from combat unscathed. Despite being battered and bruised, he refused to remain a broken ghost. And Izuku silently vowed to himself as the sky turned a pale gray hue to the first timid glow of dawn. The apartment was shrouded in silence. Only the rhythmic hammering inside Izuku's skull and the low hum of the refrigerator could be heard at 3 in the morning. The harsh fluorescent light stood in front of the bathroom mirror, a harsh arbiter. The reflection it gave back was devoid of glory. No winner. Just a boy, his cheek blossoming into a hideous black and blue bruise, his jaw burning with deep, purplish pain, and his lip split and swollen. He used a moist towel to wipe the dried blood from his mouth, his hands shaking from the last of the adrenaline and fatigue. Every touch was excruciating, a startling reminder of how vicious the blow he had received had been. The taste of defeat and rust was too strong. Yes, he had won. The two men were left on the dirty alley floor, unable to move. The mirror, however, was honest. The harsh realization of his own frailty had been the price of this victory, which had been purchased with suffering. Dawn was when the true horror started. His mother's footsteps sounded like an air raid siren in the hallway. With his face turned to the wall, he slipped into bed and prayed she wouldn't come in. The door, however, squeaked open. "Izuku, are you awake?" Inko asked in a quiet voice, but it was heavy with the worry that never goes to sleep. He muttered something incomprehensible, pretending to be sleepy. Her warm, tentative hand rested on his shoulder, and he felt her weight on the edge of the bed. "Honey, I heard you come in really late last night, and you sounded, are you okay?" With half of his face buried in the pillow, Izuku forced himself to turn. The light tasted like ash in his injured mouth. "I'm fine, Mom. I stayed out late studying and tripped running home. It was dark." Her hand went cold. She narrowed her eyes, those maternal wells of perception. She turned his face toward the light and brushed the hair from his forehead with a gentleness that disarmed him. Even worse than a punch was the gasp she let out. As though she was afraid her son might break, her fingers lingered over the outline of the bruise without making contact. Each tear that escaped her eyes was a hammer blow to Izuku's conscience. "Izuku, that's not from a fall. You've been in a fight. Was it Bakugo again?" "Oh my God, your face," she said. He said, "No, Mom, it wasn't Kachan," in a voice rife with anguish and remorse. "It was just some guys. Something stupid. It's over, I'm fine." She didn't think he was real. She noticed a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there months before. Despite the wounds, she could feel his body becoming more rigid and tense. She was losing her boy, and something that she didn't understand and that scared her was growing in his place. She begged him to take him to the hospital for the remainder of the morning, and Izuku prevailed in their battle of wills with the stubbornness of a stone wall and hollow promises. The distance between them grew, and the silence that now surrounded them was laced with fear and lies. Pain was his constant companion that night, preventing him from falling asleep. Izuku, however, wasted no time in self-pity. He opened a fresh notebook while seated at his desk with a bag of frozen peas against his jaw. He wrote in exact, frantic handwriting on the first page. "Failure analysis. Incident in Industrial Alley." Under the lonely light of his desk lamp, he studied the fight minute by minute for hours. As an engineer examining a malfunctioning engine, not as a painful recollection. Failure 1. Poor preliminary approach. The attack was predictable, but the diversion was effective. I misjudged scars. Subject A. Reaction time. When an opponent refuses to accept the grip, judo is useless. In conclusion, the initial action must be debilitating or erect an impassable obstacle. Second failure. Extended battle. I permitted a blow-for-blow exchange. Not acceptable. My biggest flaw is my resistance to damage. In direct combat, the chance of catastrophic failure increases exponentially with each second. Conclusion. Steer clear of direct conflict. The engagement should not last more than 5 seconds if it is unavoidable. First success. Deployment of the tool. The pepper spray made the difference. It produced the window required for subject B, heavy, to be neutralized. The taser worked well for finishing. In summary, tools are essential. Physical inferiority must be made up for by technological superiority. Third failure. Not enough arsenal. One taser. Just one spray. I would have been neutralized if there had been a third attacker. In conclusion, arsenal needs to be integrated, redundant, and versatile. He shut the notebook. In his mind, a new philosophy solidified, forged through suffering and analysis. He wasn't a hero. Heroes grinned as they confronted their adversaries. That was a luxury he could not afford. He was a specter. Ghosts also don't fight. Ghosts alter the surroundings, cause mayhem, and then vanish. His new motto became ingrained in his mind. Steer clear of conflict. The fight that never takes place is the best. If you can't avoid it, manage the surroundings. Confusion, smoke, and darkness are your friends. Stop it if you can't control it. Without hesitation. No pity. Incredibly effectively. The days that followed were a reconstruction ritual. His mind was racing while his body was healing slowly. An insane armorer turned his room into a workshop. Defense comes first. It was obvious from the broken jaw that he needed armor. Not big, noisy armor, but something integrated and subtle. He used the money he had been saving to purchase a used motorcycle back protector and a set of high-density skateboard pads online. He carefully disassembled them using pliers and a box cutter, removing the hardened plastic plates. He then started the laborious task of sewing them into the lining of a black hoodie and matching cargo pants using a thick needle and thread. The labor was painful and slow. Every stitch was met with protests from his bruised fingers. When it was finished, however, he wore a uniform that appeared to be regular streetwear but actually covered his back, chest, shins, and forearms with a layer of protection. It would absorb the force of a punch or bat strike, buying him valuable seconds, but it wouldn't stop a bullet. Environmental control comes next. He had been inspired by the success of the pepper spray. He required a visual barrier that would be instantaneous and impact a wider area. Smoke was the obvious answer. He entered forums for amateur chemistry and pyrotechnics, using virtual private networks (VPNs) to avoid detection. The recipe was surprisingly straightforward. Sugar and potassium nitrate, a common fertilizer, were heated until they formed a solid paste. He always paid with cash when he purchased the ingredients from various stores. He started experimenting with a small camping stove at the clearing by the river. The initial efforts failed, producing more burnt caramel than smoke. However, he was successful after modifying the temperature and proportions. When a tiny tablet the size of a coin was lit, it whistled and ejected a dense white cloud that covered several square meters in a matter of seconds. He created a dozen and kept them in tiny cardboard cylinders that had fuses that burned quickly. He called these phantom smoke bombs. And lastly, offense. Although it was a single device, the taser had been effective. To become a part of his own body, he required incapacitating capability. Gazing at his rough hands, the thought struck him: gloves. He purchased a pair of work gloves made of reinforced leather. He then carefully disassembled his taser prototype and a few others, removing the capacitors and voltage multipliers. Making it safe while reducing its size was a challenge. He drew schematics all night long, figuring out how to arrange the parts on the forearm and gloves back, with wires running underneath the fabric. A tiny pocket on the forearm would hold the 9-volt battery. He sewed the metal contacts, the taser prongs, covertly onto his middle and index finger knuckles. In the palm would be a tiny pressure switch. He would finish the circuit by clenching his fist. The initial glove proved to be successful. Much more vicious than his original prototype, a crackling arc of electricity sparked between his knuckles when he squeezed his fist. For the opposite hand, he constructed a second. He had more than just a taser now. He had two, and they were his hands, not weapons to draw. This group was known as the Spectre Gauntlets. His body was still hurting a week after the fight, but the change was total. He put on his suit. The clothing felt more substantial and rigid, an additional layer of defense. The gloves were tight and sinister looking. His pockets were heavy with smoke bombs. He gazed into the mirror at himself. The boy staring back was different, but the bruise had turned a sickly yellow. He was now motionless, with a chilly assurance that came from preparation rather than conceit. He was no longer a child acting as a vigilante. He worked as an operator. He went out once more that evening, not seeking conflict. It was a test in the field. His steps were more confident as he crossed rooftops, his silhouette a dark stain against the city's light-filled sky. He could now see the moves more clearly, and the world below resembled a chessboard. The incident happened on a side street close to a subway station. A couple of young thugs were cornering a man in a suit who was probably coming home from work late. A mugging straight out of a textbook. The Izuku of 2 weeks prior would have examined the angles, anticipating discomfort. Direct combat was not even an option for the new Izuku. He took wind and trajectory calculations from the edge of the rooftop. One of his smoke bombs came out. He threw it ahead of them, blocking their only obvious route of escape, rather than at them. The tablet struck the sidewalk. A moment later, a thick white cloud started to billow and hiss. As expected, the response was immediate. Startled, the thugs released their victim and turned to face the unexpected, unexplained barrier. What the hell? The man in the suit knew right away. He pushed one of the punks away and disappeared into the night. The two thugs stayed, eyes darting, coughing. Concerned about the smoke that was gradually going away. They searched for the source, but all they could see were blank shadows. They had lost their prey. It was their chance, gone. Nervous and frustrated, they turned and rushed away. Izuku stood motionless, watching the whole scene play out from above. He hadn't punched anyone, had not entered the alley, had remained silent. However, he had stepped in. For the victim, he had managed the surroundings and averted confrontation. An odd feeling awoke within him. Not his first victory's feverish euphoria. Not the second's bitter flavor. It was icy, heartless contentment. The fulfillment of a flawlessly carried-out plan. He turned and disappeared again into the rooftop shadows. The sound of the circuits in his gloves, and the silent promise of smoke in his pockets, had taken the place of the echo of the beatings he had endured. Another layer of the ghost's humanity had been shed, and in its place had been metal, chemistry, and terrifying efficiency. For the first time, he felt as though he had the means to traverse the dark path ahead. The city had been frozen by winter's fingers. Every breath was transformed into a transient cloud of vapor by the damp cold that seeped into the bones. The majority of people used it as an excuse to stay inside and seek out the warmth of a heater. It had turned into an ally for Izuku. The cold emptied parks, kept people off the streets, and left the night to its darker occupants. To him as well. His patrols had evolved. Patient hunts instead of anxious explorations. Wrapped in garments lined with concealed armor plates, he stood still on rooftops for hours on end, enduring the bitter cold. The lesson had been ingrained in his soul, but the pain in his jaw had faded to a dull memory. Stealth and strategy failed in direct confrontation. His greatest weapon was fear, and his shield was silence. And there was a growing sense of fear. He used a cheap parabolic microphone that he had modified to increase its range, and at first it was just whispers, bits and pieces of conversation. With his headphones on, he listened to the city's covert pulse while sitting in the dark. And I swear, dude, the Chinese guy just vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, poof. Just a puff of smoke, and the guy he was mugging was gone too. It wasn't normal smoke. It smelled chemical, like something burned. Then we found the Chinese guy in the next alley, shaking, saying something had touched him, and it felt like someone stuck fingers in a socket. With every recounting, the rumors changed and expanded. They described a silently moving shadow, a ghost powered by electricity. He was referred to as the static by some and the blackout by others. It was unclear whether he was a deranged vigilante or a new hero with a cunning quirk. In the straightforward equation of street crime, that ambiguity was a terrifying factor in and of itself. Izuku quietly fostered that legend because he understood that a man could be disarmed more easily by fear than by force. He had also become more methodical in his approach. He no longer merely responded to crimes he saw. He was now a hunter of patterns. Previously filled with hero analyses, his notebooks were now complex networks of local crime statistics. Low-level drug transaction schedules, gang route maps, and profiles of local thugs with their habits and weaknesses. He had pinpointed a number of gray zones, areas with little police presence where professional heroes only appeared when TV cameras were in the area. He discovered his next target in one of these areas, a neighborhood full of tiny stores and family-run workshops. This robbery was not an isolated incident. A system existed, not major players, but a few oddball thugs who had found it more lucrative to protect store owners than to rob them, operated a small extortion network under the name the Kiyoshi cats. Izuku studied them for a week. He braved the cold and drew diagrams and took notes while spending whole nights on rooftops with numb fingers. He recognized the leader, a slender, rodent-faced man whom everyone referred to as Rat. He was not inherently strong, but he was cunning and vicious. Two henchmen provided the muscle: Wall, a slow, burly man, and Sparks, a younger, twitchier man who was always carrying a switchblade. He took note of their routine. They went around every Tuesday and Friday night, going into stores just before they closed to get their protection fee. He could see the old store owner's hands shaking as they passed bills, and the fear in their eyes. When Rat embarrassed a baker by toppling a tray of freshly baked bread simply because he could, he smirked. Izuku felt something cold and angry in his chest when he saw that picture. This was not a passionate crime. Systematic oppression was what it was. A cancer that eats away at the soul of the neighborhood. He would also omit it. There would be no assault in the operation. The demolition would be done surgically. That night, stopping them wasn't the only objective. Their network would be dismantled, their reputation would be ruined, and they would be so terrified that they would never dare return. He picked the location with care. A small service alley behind the bakery. Their final destination for the evening. With several vertical access points provided by pipes and ledges, the alley was a choke point. It served as his playground. A freezing drizzle that covered the asphalt with a black sheen arrived on Friday night. Izuku stood on the other rooftop, a motionless figure against the darkness. He went over his equipment, which included 3 smoke bombs, fully charged electric gauntlets, and armor concealed under his clothing. He had a disposable camera in one pocket, an envelope containing pictures of their extortion rounds in another. Like clockwork, they showed up at 10:30 p.m. While Wall and Sparks waited outside, bored and haughty, Rat went inside the bakery. Izuku waited. An icy calm, the concentration of a surgeon prior to the first incision, had replaced the panic and adrenaline of his early excursions. Izuku shifted when Rat appeared, grinning greasy as he counted a wad of bills. Phase 1. Disentangle and separate. He avoided grouping them together by not throwing the smoke bomb in the center of them. Their escape to the main street was cut off when he threw the first at the end of the alley. He threw the second at the entrance to the alley a second later, enclosing them in a cage of white, thick smoke that hissed as it spread. Sparks, with his eyes darting through the swirling mist, yelled, "What the hell?" and pulled out his knife. "Rat," he yelled, "calm down, idiots. Must be the wind," but there was a sudden uneasiness in his voice. Rapid neutralization as Phase 2. Izuku fell down from the roof. Immediately behind Wall, the largest and slowest, he landed silently on a dumpster before falling to the ground. Izuku clenched his right fist before the brute could comprehend the sudden appearance of the figure. The base of Wall's skull was struck by the metal knuckles of his gauntlet. The man fell like a puppet whose strings were severed, no sound, one down, as electricity crackled. Ghostly shapes formed as the smoke swirled. "Sparks," he cried in a panicked, shrill voice, "Wall. Where are you?" Izuku, a shadow inside a shadow, moved through the fog. He saw Sparks cutting through the atmosphere. He didn't go straight for it. He flanked him, circling a brick column. Sparks abruptly turned, his eyes wide as a shadowy figure lunged. He attempted to stab, but Izuku was not present to engage in combat. His left hand sprang forward, striking the thug's wrist rather than blocking it. The electrified knuckles performed as intended. Sparks' hand clenched, causing the knife to fall to the floor. He fell next to his partner after taking a second blow to the neck. "We're down 2. Rat," was all that was left. With rodent eyes searching for a way out of the fog, the gang leader staggered back and retreated toward the alley's far wall. "Who's there? Show yourself, coward. Are you a hero?" From the fog came a low, raspy voice, distorted. A tiny modulator in Izuku's mask filters his voice. "Heroes don't come to places like this." "I do." Rat screamed in fear and rage, charging with a faintly glinting brass knuckle. Izuku remained motionless. He waited. Izuku dropped the final smoke bomb at his own feet just as Rat was about to get to him. They were swallowed up by the cloud, and for Rat, his target seemed to disappear into thin air. Where Izuku had stood, he slammed into the wall. A chill went through his neck before he could turn. The gauntlet of electricity. On top of his fallen allies, he collapsed. "We're down 3. The message is Phase 3. It was not the end of the operation. Izuku dragged the 3 bodies and piled them like garbage bags with deliberate efficiency. With the extortion money strewn all over them, he took multiple pictures of the unconscious thugs using the disposable camera. He collected the bills and placed them in the envelope with the photos that were used against him. He walked over to the back door of the bakery and placed the envelope on the doormat. The police would have indisputable proof, and the baker would get his money back. He leaned over Rat, who was starting to stir, before he left. He pushed him with the tip of his boot until his eyes opened. Rat saw only a dark silhouette and 2 glowing insect-like lenses, Izuku's modified goggles, in the waning mist. Whispering, "It's over," the distorted voice said. "This is my territory now. If I see you or your friends here again, what happened tonight will feel like a game. Disappear." Izuku fired one of his new inventions, a homemade grappling hook, toward the roof without waiting for a response. In a matter of seconds, a modified cordless drill motor lifted him into the darkness and he was gone. He watched the aftermath from the safety of a rooftop in the distance. He watched as the elderly baker opened the door, discovered the envelope, peered inside in shock, and then sobbed with relief. After making an anonymous call from a public phone, he watched the police arrive. As the thugs were handcuffed and loaded into patrol cars, he could see the bewilderment and terror on their faces. He was not euphoric. He had no sense of heroism. He experienced the icy, echoing gratification of a functioning system. He had discovered a plague, created a remedy, and carried it out flawlessly. He had incurred no physical cost. The whole psychological effect on the adversary. He peered out over the city, a maze of shadows and lights. He was no longer merely a spectator or a follower. He was now an architect. He was enforcing his own brand of order and changing his small portion of the world. Now there was a name for the murmur in the alleys, but nobody knew how to pronounce it. The ghost was also prepared for his upcoming endeavor. The work had just started, and the night was long. Izuku was learning that victory made spaces. And a void was hated by nature, particularly the city's criminal nature. The neighborhood had experienced a brief period of quiet following the dismantling of the Kiyoshi Cat's extortion network, a tenuous calm that lasted precisely 12 days. The rumors of the electric ghost had caused inexperienced criminals to reconsider their plans to operate in the region. However, the fear of others was an invitation rather than a warning to the larger predators. Izuku initially saw it as a break in the routines he had spent so much time learning. A fresh appearance. There was a distinct fear in the shopkeeper's eyes, one that was more intense and profound than the one that Rat evoked. The murmurs in the alleys also shifted. They stopped talking about ghosts. They mentioned a demon. He was known by his street name, Kato Tanaka, but they called him Razor. Izuku saw him for the first time through binoculars, 3 rooftops away, his face sliced by the cold July wind. Razor had a predator's confidence and a manner of moving that made it obvious he saw himself at the top of the food chain. He wasn't clumsy like Wall, or twitchy like Rat. A small laundromat's owner was negotiating with him. Razor smiled during the negotiation, and then a sickly white, butcher knife-length bone blade exploded out of his forearm with a wet snap. It cut a stack of fresh laundry in 2 as it slid through the air. There was no mistaking the message. The heart of Izuku stopped. This was not like the others. It was a quirk. A quirk that manifests biologically. Not just the strength of a thug, but a true power. All of his preparation and analysis felt suddenly insufficient. His smoke bombs, his electric gauntlets. Why would anyone object to a man who could make weapons out of his own flesh? It was Izuku's first week off from patrol. He searched for knowledge. Razor turned into his only fixation. He kept a close watch on him day and night, recording everything he did. A novel form of analysis filled his notebook. Codename: Kato Tanaka's Razor. Strangeness: offensive osteogenesis, unspecified term. Able to produce sharp bone protuberances from limbs, primarily the knuckles and forearms. Analysis of quirks: speed of manifestation: nearly instantaneous, 0.5 seconds. Shape and length: adaptable. Blades were measured at 15 to 40 cm. There are knuckle spikes. Physical characteristics: incredibly sharp, easily cutting soft wood and thick fabric. Durability: not sure. Under some impacts, bone is inherently brittle. Limitations: arms are the only manifestation. It's unclear if there is a time or quantity limit, or if it can be used from other body parts. No obvious pain indicates experience. Izuku came to the horrifying realization that the plastic armor he had sewed into his clothing would serve no purpose. It would be cut like paper by the razor's blades. Contact was necessary for his electric gauntlets, and it was suicide to approach a man who was a spinning storm of blades. Izuku experienced the ancient, well-known fear of being quirkless for the first time since he began. Staring at a monster he had no chance of defeating made him feel like Deku once more. However, something was different this time. He was not paralyzed by the fear. It brought him into focus. He shut his workshop and locked himself in. The formula was now different. It was now about neutralizing a superhuman advantage rather than conquering a physical disadvantage. A specific countermeasure had to be the answer if the issue was a quirk. His critical thinking got to work. What's better than a blade? Steel. However, how could he use it without losing his stealth or mobility? An ancient history book on medieval armor provided the answer: vambraces or forearm guards. He searched appliance repair shops and junkyards for 2 days. He used his meager funds to purchase stainless steel sheets from the shell of a microwave and the side of an old industrial washer. He started the arduous task in his room with a hacksaw, safety goggles, and thick gloves. He had to work when his mother wasn't home because the sound of cutting metal was so loud that he had to cover the door with blankets to keep the noise out. 2 rectangular plates, each about 30 centimeters long, were cut by him. He carefully curved them to fit his forearms using a hammer and a tiny butane torch. He riveted them onto substantial leather bases after smoothing the edges. The end product was 2 rudimentary but useful steel bracers. He incorporated them into the sleeves of his hoodie, strengthening them to prevent them from shifting. His first line of defense, his forearms, were now armored. However, blocking was insufficient. He required a method for remotely neutralizing the quirk. He was unable to approach. An Odd Memory, a documentary about firefighters fighting chemical fires with expanding foam, inspired the concept. What if he was able to make something comparable? Something immobilizing but not harmful. He went back to chemistry forums to look for adhesive compounds that react quickly. He discovered a recipe for a 2-part polyurethane resin that formed a sticky, stiff foam in a matter of seconds after expanding and solidifying. He purchased the chemicals from hardware and craft stores separately. One of the challenges was the deployment system. He modified 2 large toy water guns to solve the problem. He filled each tank with 2 distinct compartments after emptying them. Both parts would be released into a mixing nozzle by a dual-action trigger. The end product was a pair of large, unsightly, matte black devices. One-time use, but if they were effective, they could glue Razor's hands shut, preventing him from using or manifesting his blades. What he dubbed containment foam launchers. The test night finally arrived. Razor was growing more audacious. Izuku saw Razor corner the old bookshop owner, the same man he had seen frightened by Rat. However, this time, Razor wasn't requesting money. He was relishing the terror. One of his bone blades pressed against the old man's throat, a twisted grin on his face. Izuku shifted. An elaborate diversion was not in order. He fell into the alley's opening. Razor turned at the sound of his boots on wet asphalt. The elderly man seized the opportunity to return to the shop and escape. Well, Razor uttered, his smile growing. With a snap, his arm's blade retracted, giving way to 2 wider, shorter ones, 1 on each forearm. So the famous ghost is real. Heard about you. A bag of cheap tricks. What are you gonna do? Throw smoke? Or do you want me to touch you? Izuku remained silent. His new steel bracers were concealed by his wide sleeves as he dropped into a low guard. He carried one of the foam launchers behind his back in each hand. Razor growled, no words. Better that way, and then lunged forward. He moved quickly, much more quickly than any thug Izuku had ever faced. He lunged and struck Izuku in the head with a slicing blow. Out of instinct, Izuku raised his left forearm to block. It was a deafening sound. A shriing of metal, a screech of steel against bone, sparks flying into the alley. Razor's face was completely shocked. He had anticipated slicing through bone and flesh, to encounter gentle opposition. Rather, his blade struck steel that would not yield. His arm trembled from the impact. What? He stumbled to say. Izuku didn't give him any time to heal. He raised his right hand and aimed the foam launcher, using Razor's recoil to gain distance. He squeezed the trigger. Razor's right forearm and hand were covered in a thick, milky white stream that blasted out. The material instantly expanded, covering the hand and bone blade with a foamy cocoon that quickly solidified. Razor screamed, "What the hell is this?" as he attempted to shake off the sticky mass, but it only got worse. That arm's quirk was totally neutralized. He lunged again, this time with the blade of his left arm, in a panic and rage. Izuku sidestepped the initial blow and proceeded to use the second launcher. The same thing happened to Razor's left arm. He was disarmed now, trapped in two hardened blobs of foam. His greatest advantage, his source of pride and power, was rendered useless. His face contorted in shock and terror. With a whisper, "Why? You?" Izuku countered, "You still have your strength," in a distorted voice as icy as the July breeze. "Let's see if that's enough." He charged after dropping the empty launchers. The ensuing battle was brief and vicious. Razor was a scared man without his blades. He threw a punch, which Izuku quickly parried and countered. He lost his breath due to a blow to the solar plexus. He was unbalanced by a low sweep. Izuku clenched his fist as Razor fell to his knees, gasping. The side of his head was struck by the electric gauntlet. Razor's body trembled and then collapsed, unconscious, as the taser hissed viciously. Izuku remained motionless, his chest rising and falling as the cold air held his breath in dense clouds. He examined his forearm. Where Razor's blade had struck the steel bracer, there was a deep gouge. His arm would have been torn apart without it. He was struck by the starkness of reality. He was victorious. He had used his intellect, not strength, to defeat a quirk user. He had planned, studied, and carried out. His greatest weapon was the need to think, which he had transformed from his greatest weakness, the absence of a quirk. Using a piece of hardened foam to tape an anonymous note to Razor's chest, he left him immobilized for the police. It said, quite simply, "A quirk is just a tool. Learn how to use it." A new realization dawned on him as he vanished into the darkness. The real game was this. Each quirk presented a fresh challenge. There is a new equation to solve for every villain. He had no idea how dangerous the road ahead would be. He didn't feel like a quirkless outsider in a world of superpowers, though, for the first time as he gazed over the city from the rooftops. It seemed as though he was the only one with the instruction manual. He was also prepared to write the following chapter. Kiyoshi Ward was not cleaned by the rain, rather, it only made the dirt shine. It fell in a monotonous, unrelenting drizzle that gathered in puddles of oil and apathy and beaded on rusty fire escapes. The district's new, fragile silence following Kato, Razor, Tanaka's fall had been accompanied by this melancholy drumbeat for 2 weeks. There was no peace in the silence. A breath was held. Through the thin armor of his hoodie, Izuku watched it from the skeletal frame of an old water tower, the cold metal pressing against his back. Down below, the neighborhood was a terrain of rumors. The most noticeable indication was the graffiti. A stylized, crackling lightning bolt next to a hooded, featureless face had replaced the crude tags that had previously denoted the Kiyoshi cat's former territory. The electric ghost. Others interpreted it as a warning of a new species of monster, while others saw it as a sign of protection. Once paying protection money with bleak eyes, shopkeepers now paused for a moment before lowering their steel shutters. Their eyes would wander to the rooftops as they swept the water from their stoops, looking for an imaginary shadow. As feeble and diluted as the winter sun, it was a timid hope. However, it was present. Izuku was not proud. What he had written on Razor's chest, "A quirk is just a tool. Learn how to use it," hadn't been issued to the public or law enforcement. It was a thesis statement, a statement of intent, nailed to the door of a corrupt society. He had vanquished not only a man but also the notion that having a quirk automatically granted one authority. But his stomach turned when he saw the ghost icon spray painted on a wall. A beacon was a symbol. The target was a symbol. He had aimed to be an invisible, accurate scalpel. He was being turned into a sledgehammer by the world, which was desperate for a story. On a Tuesday evening, the first sound of that hammer was heard. The alleys smelled of rancid noodles and wet trash, and the rain had gotten heavier. In an attempt to fill Razor's power void, Izuku was pursuing a new group of young aspirants who were more blustery than intelligent. They were predictable, noisy, and awkward. However, a scream of pure agony, not fear, pierced the night before he could even come up with a plan. He practiced his silence and came in a flash, a blur of dark clothing. He was stunned by what he discovered. He didn't do it. It was a cruel, twisted parody. He was powerless to stop it. Not without coming out as himself, not without getting into a tumultuous three-way fight for which he was unprepared. From the shadows, He saw the masked man finally abandon his victims, muttering and broken, before running off with the amateurish clumsiness. Izuku remained, the filth he sensed clinging to his soul unwashed by the chilly rain. It screamed because he had made an echo. Official voices from the city were starting to yell back. Izuku sat in his room, listening to an old radio he had salvaged, surrounded by the smell of ozone and solder from keeping his gauntlets in good condition. The news reports were a patchwork of false information and presumptions. The more astute reporters alluded to something different, calling it gang warfare or escalating street violence. The announcer stated solemnly, and while police remain tight-lipped about the vigilante known as the Electric Ghost, sources within the hero community are taking notice. Unconfirmed reports suggest that the pro-hero Eraserhead, known for his work in underground operations, has been assigned to investigate the surge in quirkless-related violence in the district. Izuku's hands became motionless. Eraserhead, the one hero he really looked up to. A man who leveled the playing field by neutralizing quirks through skill, cunning, and reason. Now he would be the target of that same critical eye. His forest was being invaded by a professional hunter. Just now, the game board had tipped dangerously. He no longer felt safe in his haven, the deserted clearing by the river where he had made his body and will. The following night, in need of the comforting aroma of damp earth and river plants, he went there. To get his bearings, he needed to feel the compacted dirt underfoot. However, there was a problem. He had moved a single flat stone a few inches to the left, which he always kept at the edge of his training circle. No one else would ever notice it. It was a tiny detail. It was a screaming alarm to Izuku. This place had been visited. Someone who was aware that this was his position. His heart pounded like a frantic, imprisoned bird against his ribs. His senses alert, he looked around the clearing. A tiny, folded piece of paper was tucked under the edge of the big rock he used for pull-ups, barely perceptible against the black dirt. It wasn't purchased from a store. It folded precisely, and it was thick, like artist's paper. He picked it up with shaky hands. Both a name and a signature were absent. Just 2 lines of text, in black ink, written in a neat, steady hand. I'm watching too, and not all monsters bleed. Izuku's lungs emptied. His bones were soaked with the night's chill, a frost unrelated to the weather. I'm also watching. He mistakenly believed that he was the only player on the board, but the words suggested that there was another player there, a hidden observer. Was it a copy, Eraserhead, or someone else? Furthermore, not every monster bleeds. The line that scared him was that one. His entire strategy and toolkit was based on the straightforward physical principle of incapacitating, neutralizing, and winning the physical battle. Steel bracers, foam launchers, and taser gauntlets were all instruments to cause a monster to bleed, fall, or shatter. However, what about the monsters that were impervious to punching? The ones whose influence poisoned the veins of the city, the ones in government offices, the ones in corporate high-rises. He stood for a while, the paper getting wet from the rain, the note clenched in his hand. The roaring in his own ears seemed to drown out the sounds of the city. A creature of the shadows and alleys, he was a ghost. However, he was starting to understand that the alleys weren't where the most dangerous darkness was. The systems were what caused those alleys to fester. And someone had just glanced back at him from somewhere in that deeper darkness. It was a poison note. It was now circulating with each frantic heartbeat after leaking beneath his skin and into his bloodstream. Sleep had been a stranger for 3 days. Once a gymnasium and workshop, Izuku's bedroom was now used as an intelligence analysis cell. The fine paper, smoothed out on a black cloth like a sacred, horrible relic, sat in the harsh glare of his desk lamp. He had examined everything. The paper itself is pricey, has a subtle texture, and is high grammage. Not something from a shady shop. The ink was applied with a steady, assured hand and was a deep, waterproof black, probably from a fountain pen. There were no signs of emotion or haste in the handwriting, which was exact and nearly calligraphic. It was the handwriting of someone who was methodical and patient. I'm also watching. The words reverberated in the void behind his eyes. It wasn't threatening in the same sense as a fist. It was a positional statement. He had no idea that the voice was coming from a different area of the chessboard. Eraserhead was a plausible but unlikely possibility. Instead of communicating with a mysterious note, a professional hero would take action. This type of psychological chess was too brutal and unsophisticated for the copycat vigilante. It was someone else, a 4th, 5th, or 3rd player. The city, which he had mapped out and started to comprehend, felt like a foreign planet again when he thought about it. Furthermore, Not every monster bleeds. This was the poison's central component. It was an outright, savage blow to his whole worldview. All of his techniques, the martial arts, the armor, the gauntlets, and the foam, were based on the notion of direct physical contact. They were instruments made to cause a monster to bleed, fall, or shatter. The note informed him that there were dragons, and he had stocked up on weapons to combat dogs. Every encounter was replayed in his mind, a machine now trained for compulsive analysis. Razor was among the extortionists, drunks, thugs, and others. All of them were bleeding monsters. They were issues that had tangible fixes. What about a slumlord who evicted families by taking advantage of legal loopholes? What about a business leader whose organization released poisonous waste, a slow-acting poison covered up by profit margins, into the river? What about a dishonest politician who eliminated funds for hero patrols in impoverished areas like this one, thereby creating the exact void in which he now functioned? And those were monsters. Additionally, they had no weak spots that a resin baton could hit. Layers of wealth, public opinion, and bureaucracy served as their armor. An account in a bank could not be tasered. A legal contract could not be obscured by a smoke bomb. It dawned on him like the slow, crushing pressure of the deep ocean, rather than like a flash of lightning. He was a street-level fix for a structural issue, an infected wound with a bandage on it, and the note's writer was aware of it. They were assessing him, not merely observing him, and they had discovered that he was lacking. His whole approach was out of date. The chair at his desk creaked in the deafening 4 a.m. silence as he pushed back. A boy with pale, haunted features and hollowed-out eyes was reflected in his dark computer screen. His last fight's bruises had healed, but they had been replaced by a deeper, new exhaustion. He was fighting too many battles. He was fighting against the criminals in the alleys, the imitator he had influenced, the professional heroes who were now pursuing him, the covert observer who left notes in his haven, and his own mother's smothering, fearful love. The war he was losing the most viciously was that one. The confrontation he had been dreading finally materialized the following morning. Inko sat down to breakfast without saying a word. With rigid movements, she set a bowl of miso soup and rice in front of him. There was more silence in the tiny apartment than any smoke bomb he could ever make. He ate mechanically, keeping his eyes on his bowl. "You don't sleep anymore," she finally said. There was no question. Izuku hesitated with his chopsticks. The lie sounded awkward and fragile on his tongue as he said, "I'm fine, Mom. Just studying." She added, "Your lights are on all night. I hear you pacing. You've lost weight," her voice sounding uncannily composed, devoid of its typical panicked edge. It was a person who had shed all of their tears and was now filled with a stern, unyielding certainty. "And you don't mumble about heroes anymore. You don't watch those old videos." With her hands clasped on the table, she took a seat across from him. His chest ached from what he saw when he forced himself to look at her. Though it was hidden beneath layers of resolve and a pain so intense that it appeared to have aged her overnight, the fear in her eyes was still there. For the first time, her voice wavered as she said, "I don't know who you're fighting, Izuku. And I know you won't tell me. I know you think you're doing something important, something right. But whatever it is, it's hollowing you out. You're becoming a ghost in your own home. I look at you, and I see my son, but he's behind a wall of glass. I'm scared I'm going to lose you. Not to a villain's punch. I'm scared I'm going to lose you right here, at this table, and you'll still be sitting in front of me." He didn't know how to respond. She was telling the truth. It would be disrespectful to apologize. It would be more cruel to deny. As a result, he remained silent, making a confession that hurt her feelings more than any deception could. With no taste in his mouth, he finished his breakfast and got up to go to school. He hesitated as he walked past her, a vestige urge urging him to console her. However, he was unsure of how. Threat analysis and tactical schematics were gradually displacing the part of him that understood how. The sound of her quiet, broken sob followed him down the hall as he simply put a hand on her shoulder for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment before walking away. He went on patrol that night with a new mission. He wasn't hunting. He was paying attention. He was observing. His goal was now to comprehend the new geometry of the shadows rather than to interfere. Everything had been reframed by the note. The violence on the streets was a symptom, not the illness. The system had to make sense to him. Destabilized by his own actions and deserted by the heroes, the district was falling into a fever. The brittle calm had broken, and chaos had taken its place. From a rooftop with a view of a deserted market square, he witnessed it. A turf war broke out. It was a chaotic, unsightly fracas rather than a well-organized fight. The remaining members of the Kyoshi Cats were attempting to retake their territory on one side. A new crew, a group of hyenas known as the Grinders, was on the other. There was a gallery of desperation in their quirks. A man was attempting to bob down his opponents with a quirk that allowed him to spit a sticky, foul-smelling slime. Another used painful-looking plosives to launch regenerating projectiles from his teeth. She was pressing herself against a brick wall, her arms turning into coarse, abrasive weapons, and the woman with the Grinders had skin that could temporarily mimic the texture of whatever she touched. It was brutally effective and horribly pitiful. This was not the heroic, televised, clean fight. People were using their bodies as weapons in hideous ways in order to wrest control of a dying neighborhood. This was the reality of a world without heroes. With his notebook in hand, Izuku observed, making notes on positions, identifying quirk limitations, and assessing how the fight unfolded. He experienced a deep sense of disengagement, the detached viewpoint of a general examining a battlefield map. This was beyond his control. Not by themselves. It would be suicide to step in. He was limited to recording the fall. Then he caught sight of them. 3 figures were standing just outside the main streetlight glow on the opposite rooftop. Their silhouettes stood out against the smog-filled orange sky of the city, and they were motionless. They were not heroes. They weren't law enforcement. Their well-tailored, plain dark suits looked ridiculously out of place in this run-down area of the city. They were not taking part in the mayhem down below. They were watching it. Similar to him. His heart froze. His hands were remarkably steady as he focused his binoculars. The men showed no emotion. One of them was whispering into his cufflink. Another, a big, necked man, just watched, his face uninterested. Leaner than the others, the third man appeared to sense Izuku's eyes. He slowly swiveled his head to face Izuku's hiding place on the other side of the square. Izuku froze, all of his instincts telling him to retreat, to vanish. However, he was unable to. Even at this distance, the man's eyes seemed to fix him. His features were sharp, his hair was swept back neatly, and his face was composed and intelligent. There was no overt danger, no obvious quirk. But more menacing than razor's bone blades was the unwavering confidence that radiated from him. Izuku stared at the man for a long, frightful moment. White noise drowned out the commotion of the gang war below. The area between 2 rooftops was the only thing left in the world. The man then did something that made Izuku feel extremely cold. He grinned. The smile was slight, sly, almost pitying. There was no danger. It was dismissed. It was a king's smile as he watched 2 kids quarrel in the dirt over a broken toy. "I see you, little ghost," said the smile. "You're playing in the dirt, I see. This isn't your game, though. You're not a participant. You're just a part of the landscape." A moment later, the man nodded to his friends in a faint, nearly imperceptible way. The 3 suit-clad men turned and vanished as if they had never been there, melting back into the rooftop shadows. Izuku's breath came in rough gasps as he finally slumped against the rooftop brick chimney. Cold, sharp adrenaline surged through his body. Even though he hadn't been in a fight, he felt more defeated than when he and the extortionist were in the alley. The message. The suit-wearing men. They had a connection. Those were the non-bleeding monsters. There was no need for them to fight in the mud. They would move in to take what was left after allowing the smaller monsters to kill one another. They were observing, evaluating, and waiting for the right opportunity to seize power. Everyone else was playing checkers, but they were playing chess. With a hopelessly delayed response, he staggered back to his apartment in a daze as sirens finally started to blare in the distance. He went directly to his desk, avoiding his bed. The old notebooks with their combat drills and hero analyses were pushed aside. They were remnants of a simpler time. He produced a brand new notebook. Labeled, black, hardcover. He turned to the first page of it. The title of his old series, Hero Analysis for the Future, echoed in his mind like a child's nursery rhyme as he stared at the blank sheet for a long time. With a new, frightening clarity, he picked up his pen, his hand steady now. He wrote a new title at the top of the page. Threat Analysis. Kyoshi Ward's Ecosystem. He went to the first page of the entry. His handwriting was just as neat and accurate as the anonymous note's ink. The men in suits as the first entry. Notable observation. Unknown organization. They are highly intelligent, professional, and disciplined. Avoid direct confrontation. Instead, they watch and examine power imbalances. Consolidating all criminal activity in the district under a single, corporate-like structure could be the goal. Apex predators are in status. There are currently no countermeasures. Critical is the top priority. His room was filled with long, gray shadows as the sun started to rise. Izuku was unaware. He was no longer a young man acting heroically in the shadows. He was fighting an enemy he had no idea how to defeat in a war he had just learned about. The first lesson of the Bloody Society, which had revealed its face, was complete humility. He needed to mature, and he needed to do it quickly. Or the game wouldn't even start before he was removed from the board. The men in suits screamed in silence. Izuku had been hunting a ghost more ethereal than himself for 3 weeks following the rooftop encounter. His evenings had changed. A chilly, compulsive stillness replaced the hectic, action-driven patrols. His world shrunk to the view through a pair of powerful binoculars or the long lens of a digital camera, and he transformed into a gargoyle sitting on the concrete ledges of the city. He was searching for a pattern, a signal, or a whisper of the organization that had watched the chaos in the city with the placid interest of gods, not for crimes to put an end to. He discovered nothing. His annoyance manifested physically as a chilly knot in his stomach that grew tighter with each night that went without results. His workshop felt more like a mausoleum for his own shortcomings than a place of creation and advancement. Long-range, grainy photos of the 3 men were pinned to a large corkboard. The public facial recognition software he accessed through layers of encrypted networks could not make out their faces, which were pixelated blurs. It was like trying to shape smoke, but he had spent hours trying to improve them, to extract one distinct feature from the digital noise. His notebooks, which had once been his greatest asset, now served as evidence of his shortcomings. Threat analysis. There was only one, incredibly limited entry into the Kiyoshi Ward ecosystem. He had spent his days exploring Kiyoshi Ward's corporate structures in the digital archives of the municipal library in an attempt to tackle the issue from a different perspective. He looked for any financial irregularity that might point to a hidden power, for interlocking directorates, and for shell corporations. The men in suits, however, were experts. If there were any traces of them, they were hidden by legal firewalls and decades of transactions that appeared to be legitimate. As a young boy with a library card, he was attempting to outsmart masters of a game whose rules he was only now starting to understand. The very thing that he thought made him unique, this methodical, intellectual approach, was failing. Pure, icy desperation gave rise to the realization, which compelled a paradigm change. One night, as he sat on a rain-soaked fire escape with the city lights glinting in his weary eyes, the idea came to him with ruthless clarity. A wolf cannot be found by looking for its den. You'll never locate it. You have to track down its kills. You have to pay attention to the sheep's bleeding. He had set his sights too high. He had been searching the outside for the system's designers. He had to track down their victims. He had to get off his rooftops and go among the injured. It was a startling shift in strategy. It needed a new kind of invisibility, a new kind of stealth. Here, it did no good to be the dreaded shadow known as the electric ghost. He had to turn into the nobody he had been before all of this started. One more face among the oppressed multitude. His patrols led him to locations that even the police only went to enforce and that heroes never went to. He listened to the muttered curses of men who had lost everything as he haunted the outskirts of filthy pachinko parlors where hope went to die. He sat in the corner of a 24-hour diner, listening to hushed, desperate conversations while nursing a single cup of cold tea. The place smelled of stale grease and regret. He began going to the soup kitchen by the industrial canal for the atmosphere of unadulterated, unfiltered adversity rather than the food. He witnessed the real face of a society devoid of heroes here. In order to prevent her child's thin soup from becoming cold in the damp air, he observed a woman who had a minor quirk that enabled her to warm objects with her touch. He saw a man whose face was a road map of old bruises, and whose skin secreted a harmless, bioluminescent sweat that made him a walking target for every bored thug. These were neither heroes nor villains. Armed with grotesquely unworkable mutations, they were merely humans attempting to live in a world that had declared them statistically inconsequential. He started hearing stories among these individuals, amidst the murmurs of loan sharks and trivial rivalries. Tales of people who weren't simply robbed or beaten. Tales of individuals who just disappeared. He had heard the name for the first time from a man they called Old Man Tatsu. A skeletal figure covered in layers of discarded blankets, he was a fixture beneath the Nakano Bridge. He asserted that his quirk enabled him to perceive the emotional color that is left on objects, a subtle, synesthetic remnant of happiness, grief, or fear. Izuku had cautiously approached him, bringing a steaming bento box he had purchased with his own dwindling savings and 2 heat packs to keep the chill from getting to him. Tatsu just ate for a long time, his gnarled hands shaking. Izuku waited while sitting quietly. Tatsu finally rasped, "They're not dead," his voice sounding like gravel scuffing rock. He gazed at the pillar of concrete next to him. Not in the usual way. The ones the Yakuza take, the ones the villains snatch, they leave a bright, loud scream behind. A flash of red terror. These new ones, they just go gray. A slow, fading gray. Like a photograph left in the sun. Izuku asked softly, "Where do they go?" Tatsu looked at Izuku, his cataract-clouded eyes shifting. There was a deep, old fear in them. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of rottenness, and said, "You don't ask that question, kid. Not out loud. There's a hole in this city. A drain. And all the trash, all the forgotten bits, all the people who owe too much or run too far, they circle it. And sooner or later, they fall in. They fall into the sink." The name hung heavy and unsightly between them. Tatsu went on, "It ain't a place you can find on a map," his voice fading to a whisper of conspiracy. "It's a one-way door. A place that finds you when you've got nothing left to lose and nowhere else to fall. And once you're in, you ain't never coming out. You just become part of the sewage." With a boogeyman as a name, Izuku's investigation gained new momentum. The sink. For the next week, he chained himself to the Central Library's public computer terminals and spent his time exploring the city's archives while his fingers fluttered on the keyboard. He compared geographic data with the names of the recently missing, which were scraped from missing persons forums and whispered conversations. A trend started to take shape. Many of the missing people's last known locations were in the deserted Western District, which was home to the notorious Tateyama public housing complex. He retrieved the initial schematics, plans from a more hopeful time. The Tateyama complex was a self-contained city, not just a structure. A huge, brutalist superstructure that includes commercial areas, residential blocks, and a multi-level, deep underground transit and maintenance system. Before a dishonest city council and the tumultuous rise of second-generation quirks caused its budget to be cut, it was heralded as the social housing of the future. Now, it stands as an incomplete concrete tomb. 40 years ago, news reports described its decommissioning and sealed entrances. But his mind kept repeating what Tatsu had said. A door that only opens in one direction. Physical reconnaissance was his next course of action. He started investigating the Tateyama complex's perimeter, which the majority of Kiyoshi residents deliberately avoided. It was even more intimidating and monolithic up close. It towered over the terrain like the skeletal remains of some enormous animal. Sagging fences covered in rust. The lowest level of the faded graffiti covering the concrete walls was so old that it was essentially a chronicle of long-forgotten gangs. There was a sense of deep decay and death about the place. It wasn't dead, though. Yes, he saw scavengers. People in small groups slipping through fence gaps to salvage scrap metal or strip copper wire. They moved, however, with a hunted, frantic energy. They would rush in, seize what they could, and run, always turning their heads back toward the black, gaping maw of the complex itself rather than the outside world. They were terrified of something within, not of being apprehended by the police. He was aware of his proximity. He couldn't just walk in and risk it. Dozens of entry points were used by the scavengers. He had to locate the real threshold, the main artery. He started monitoring the people who fled the building's shadow rather than the structure itself. He hid in an abandoned building across the street for 2 days, recording the comings and goings, until he located his target. The man had the sallow, gaunt appearance of a severe drug addict. He half ran, half stumbled out of the complex, clutching a small, dirty sack as a new, unsightly bruise purpled his cheek. He chose not to use the main route. He hid in the maze of service roads and deteriorating back alleys that suffocated the neighborhood. Izuku trailed behind, a quiet figure in his black armor. The chase was a tense, stealthy ballet. Izuku walked along the tops of walls and across rooftops, following the man's frantic scrambling below. Because of his paranoia, the man would frequently pause to glance over his shoulder, his gaze darting into the darkness. Izuku's breathing would become slow and deliberate as he froze, melting into the urban decay. Lastly, neither a house nor a dealer's den was visited by the man. He ran in the direction of a huge, dilapidated highway overpass, a remnant of a transit scheme that had been shelved along with the Tateyama project. Hidden beneath the arching concrete, choked with weeds and decades of refuse, was a service tunnel. It had a huge black square for an entrance, surrounded by so much graffiti that it appeared to be a solid mass of evil writing. After a final, frightened glance around, the man slipped into the darkness like a rat plunging into a sewer. It was this. Izuku's bones sensed it. It wasn't a bolt hole for scavengers. It was an entrance. The location, the fear, the finality of it. He moved to a section of the overpass that had collapsed, a closer vantage point, and waited. 40 minutes later, two more figures, a man and a woman, with grim, determined faces, approached the mouth of the same tunnel and vanished inside without a second's hesitation, rewarding his patience. Twilight faded into night, and Izuku stayed in his hiding place, the lights of the city flickering on, a sickly orange glow that did not break through the complete darkness of the tunnel's entrance. He experienced a deep, instinctive terror, a chilly dread unrelated to the actual danger of combat. It was a fear of the unknown, of willingly leaving the comfort zone of the familiar. The familiar feel of the Spectre gauntlets and the weight of his tools provided a slight but insufficient comfort as he performed a last check of his equipment. He pictured the men in suits, watching the world from their invisible, high vantage point. A place you fall into, he recalled old man Tatsu saying. He was opting to tumble. He took a deep breath that tasted of exhaust fumes and rain, a final taste of the world above, and got to his feet. His resolve hardening into a cold, sharp point, he thought, the men in suits watching from the top. I must begin at the bottom in order to comprehend them. He reached the gaping maw, slid down from his perch, and landed silently on the cracked asphalt. The air at the threshold was immediately colder and smelled faintly of damp concrete and rot. He gave the far-off, glistening lights of the city, a world that had forgotten this place even existed, one final glance. Then he crossed the threshold and was completely engulfed by the darkness. The tunnel's darkness was a living thing. It was a suffocating, absolute physical presence that pressed in from all sides. The smell was so ancient that it seemed to be woven into the concrete itself. The thick, humid air tasted of mildew and decay. Only a few meters in, Izuku stopped to give his eyes time to adjust, but there was no light to do so. All ambient lighting had disappeared along with the city. The abrupt silence, the lack of wind and traffic, deafened him. He could only hear his own heart pounding frantically and the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water leaking through ceiling cracks up ahead. He covered his right eye with a piece of equipment. An old night vision camera was used to make this rudimentary, homemade low-light monocle, which was connected to a battery pack on his belt. The world resolved into a deep, impenetrable black and a sickly green, swimming, grainy landscape. The tunnel was a branching network of service conduits, a web of veins buried deep within the ground, rather than a straightforward corridor. The lifeblood of the society below, stolen electricity, hummed through thick, insulated cables that were slippery with moisture and slithered along the walls. Unnaturally silent, he walked forward, a ghost in a purgatory-tinted green. Discarded food wrappers, empty bottles, and crude, spray-painted arrows pointing deeper into the labyrinth were among the debris left by a hidden population that littered the floor. His senses alert, he followed them. He could still not, or would not, identify the faint, coppery tang he'd noticed at the entrance, but it grew stronger, an undercurrent to the smell of rot. The slender hallway started to open up after what seemed like an eternity of walking. A growing clamor overtook the rhythmic dripping, a low, continuous roar akin to a far-off waterfall, broken by sharp, metallic clangs and the hazy yelling of a sizable crowd. Around the next corner bled a yellow, shaky light. Controlling his breathing, Izuku pressed himself flat against the damp, cold wall and looked over the edge. His lungs were robbed of air by the sight that met his eyes. It was a cavern, an unfathomably large area, a man-made chasm that might have engulfed an entire city block. It must have been a significant transit hub for the defunct complex or a subterranean water treatment facility. The ceiling, lost entirely in the suffocating darkness above, was supported by a forest of enormous concrete pillars. The upper levels were crisscrossed by a network of catwalks and rusty gantries, which created a complex, three-dimensional setting. A disorganized collection of repurposed industrial floodlights, suspended from chains or perched precariously on ledges, lit the entire cavern. They created deep pockets of shadow and overlapping, stark circles of jaundiced light, creating an environment of stark contrasts that would be ideal for a creature of the dark to hunt. What really astounded him, though, was the life thriving in the light. It was a city, a sickly underground metropolis, a testament to human desperation. A makeshift society had established itself here. He spotted dozens, maybe hundreds. The main pathways were lined with makeshift stalls, which were constructed from stolen plywood and sheet metal. A third served a steaming, unidentifiable stew from a huge, dented pot, another sold scavenged electronics, and a third piled mismatched clothes. A crude bar served a sulky crowd of patrons a murky, foul-smelling liquid from plastic barrels. This underworld's inhabitants were just as damaged as their surroundings. Their eyes were either sharp with a feral paranoia or vacant with despair, and their faces were hard. Scars were more common than smiles. He saw women and men with the subtle but distinct marks of minor quirks. A woman's skin had a faint, chitinous sheen, one man's fingers were too long, joined like the legs of a spider. These were the trash that the world had discarded, the indebted, the criminal, the social outcasts, now confined to this isolated ecosystem. He couldn't help but look at the roar's origin. There was a large circular pit carved out of the concrete floor in the very middle of the cavern, encircled by a roaring, jeering crowd. It had dark stains on its walls. Inside, in the glare of multiple focused floodlights, two men were fighting with horrific ferocity. It wasn't a back alley fight. It was a ritual, a show. One of the fighters was a bull of a man, with muscles bulging from a combination of steroids or some strength-enhancing quirk. The other was wirier and smaller, with what appeared to be sharpened bicycle chains wrapped around his knuckles. The crowd screamed with every blow. It was a performance of violence, a form of money, and a dispute resolution process that superseded all other laws. It was not a struggle for supremacy. As the wiry man ducked a clumsy swing and raked his chains across the larger man's back, creating bloody furrows in his flesh, Izuku watched with a cold horror seeping into him. The crowd's roar grew louder as the bigger man roared in agony and rage. The coppery odor that filled the air now made sense to Izuku. It was the persistent, overpowering smell of blood. A better view was what he needed. He had to know the balance of power in this grotesque place. Under the cover of the crowd's distraction, he slipped into a pocket of shadow and started climbing the rusted ladder he saw leading up to the network of catwalks. The cavern appeared to be a schematic of hell from the gantry high overhead. Everything was visible to him. He took out his notebook and began sketching the fighters, the crowd, and the layout with a feverish intensity. And he started to see the order in the chaos from this vantage point. The terrain was dominated by two different factions. The first were a swarm of untamed, vicious brutes that gathered around the main entrance and dominated the cavern's main passageways. Compared to the others, they were bigger, noisier, and more aggressively territorial. They decked themselves out in rudimentary, menacing tattoos and scrap metal armor. Pure, unadulterated fear was the source of their power, and they applied it without hesitation. To settle a quarrel over a bottle of liquor, he saw their apparent leader, a monstrously large man with a rusty metal contraption of gears and pistons in place of his lower jaw, slam the offender's head into a concrete pillar, leaving him bleeding and dazed on the ground. Izuku tagged them in his mind. The Iron Fangs. More eerie was the second faction. They stayed in the cavern's deeper areas, close to a huge, sealed blast door that was the source of the low, industrial hum. They had a cold, clinical intelligence in their eyes, were leaner, and moved with a quiet discipline. Their strength lay in technology rather than overt acts of violence. Izuku saw one of their members, a man with a long coat and eerily clean hands, pass a small, labeled vial to a fighter who was waiting for his turn to go to the pit in a discreet manner. The fighter gulped down the contents without saying a word. These were the creators of the steroids and combat drugs that fed the battlegrounds, the architects of this violent society. By trying to create superhumans from the shattered remains of the damned, they were pursuing a perverse kind of evolution. He tagged them. The core of Chimera. Tension simmered along the invisible boundary between these two groups. The Chimera Corp's cold, practical science contrasted with the Iron Fangs, unbridled, untamed brutality. This was the Sync's main conflict and its driving force. From below came a sharp, frightened cry that broke his analysis. A young woman, probably new here, had stumbled and spilled her cup of water on an Iron Fang brute, her face still containing a ghost of the world above. Furious at the alleged slight, the man spun around and took her arm, pulling her off her feet. He drew back a huge fist and roared, "You worthless piece of trash. You'll pay for that with your teeth." His voice reverberated throughout the cavern. There was no protest from the surrounding crowd. They formed a circle and retreated, their faces waiting for the spontaneous display of brutality. Here, this was the law. Pain was the price paid for any offense, no matter how minor. Izuku froze, concealed on the overhead gantry. All of his tactical instincts told him to hide. Watch. Examine. Don't participate. He was a spark, and this place was a keg of powder. It was suicidal and illogical to intervene. His icy reasoning was shattered against the foundation of his character when he saw the girl's face and the utter, hopeless terror in her eyes. He recalled the alley. As he watched and hid, he recalled the sense of his own worthlessness. He was unable to do it. He would never again be that person. In a situation where it was bound to fail, his plan was a desperate improvisation, a classic ghost maneuver. Near the crowd's edge, he noticed a tall, unstable pile of rusted, empty oil barrels. He moved like a silent wraith in the deep shadows as he clambered along the catwalk. He drew one of his final smoke bombs and positioned himself directly above the stack. He made no hesitation. He let it fall. He immediately fell after it, sliding most of the way behind a big, abandoned generator with a thick power cable before letting go and landing in a cushioned roll. The moment was ideal. The smoke bomb struck the barrels with a loud clang as he was taking cover, and a second later it ignited. Suddenly the area was covered in a huge cloud of thick, choking white smoke. Completely unprepared, the crowd turned into a coughing, terrified huddle. Momentarily dazed and blinded, the Iron Fang savage let go of the girl. It was Izuku's opportunity. He emerged from the shadows, a shadowy figure slipping through the white mist. He refrained from confronting the brute. Instead of hurting the man, he used his momentum to knock him off balance and make room by slamming his shoulder into his side. Izuku hissed at the frightened girl, "Run!" in a low, commanding voice. Her eyes were wide with shock as she gazed at him, a ghost emerging from the smoke to save her. The survival instinct prevailed. She turned and ran away, vanishing into the frantic confusion. Izuku, however, had forgotten the basic rule of this place. Hiyashi Ward was not where he was. The sink was where he was. In this case, disobedience was a declaration of war rather than merely an insult. "Grab him!" A voice boomed through the smoke, a voice amplified by metal and filled with absolute rage. Guro, the Iron Fang's leader, was there. The brute he had pushed spun around with a roar of rage and swung a blind, backhand punch into the smoke before Izuku could react and melt back into the darkness. Izuku made an attempt to turn away, but he was too close and too slow. He was struck squarely in the left side of his chest by the blow, which was a hammer of pure muscle. It was a white-hot supernova of pain. In his own ears came a sharp, final crack that made him sick. Crushing darkness and swimming lights shattered the world into a kaleidoscope. Every time he tried to breathe, the air in his lungs disappeared, and he fell to his knees, gasping, the pain radiating from his ribs. He was grabbed by rough hands and brutally pulled to his feet. The focused, blunt force trauma had been unabated by the armor beneath his hoodie. At Goro's feet, he was hauled from the fading smoke and flung onto the dirty concrete floor. His followers formed a tight, threatening circle around the metal-jawed leader, who towered over him like a hideous caricature of power. Well, Goro said in a voice that sounded like metal grating against bone. He poked Izuku's head with the toe of his heavy, steel-capped boot and said, "A new rat in our sewer. You've got guts, I'll give you that, you shit. But in the sink, guts just get you spilled on the floor. Who are you with?" The Chimera Corps sent a new toy to play with. Izuku coughed, leaving a trail of saliva and blood on the floor. He was unable to form words. A physical thing, a monster with its claws deep inside him, was causing the pain in his chest. Guro laughed, deep and rumbling. He smiled, and the metal plates of his jaw opened to reveal rows of sharpened, shark-like teeth. "Silent type, huh? Doesn't matter. You broke the rules. And here," he said, pointing with a huge thumb to the fighting pit, "we have a very simple way of dealing with that. You want to play the hero? Fine. You can fight for your life. Win, and you can crawl back to whatever hole you came from. Lose, and your body will help fill the pit." Izuku's heart fell into a pit of icy horror. Unceremoniously, he was thrust into the blood-soaked dirt of the fighting ring and dragged across the floor, his boots making two shallow tracks in the dirt. Now the crowd's roar was deafening, a physical force hammering him. They were thrilled, and they smelled blood, fresh blood. On the other side of the pit, he watched a heavy metal gate grind open as he fought to get up, his broken ribs screaming in protest. They pushed a new fighter through. He was a massive man, larger than the one he had engaged in combat with. He had a thick, gray, craggy hide that resembled granite. It wasn't skin. A quirk of rock skin. A living stone wall. Izuku stood up at last, swaying, each breath a new, piercing pain. On his hands, the specter gauntlets had the feel of toys. His greatest weapon, his mind, was obscured by a fog of pain. The unwilling star of a blood sport, he was hurt, alone, and imprisoned in a gladiatorial pit. The audience chanted. With a low growl, the stone-skinned man started to stomp toward him, his footsteps trembling the earth. The young man who aspired to be a hero had passed away. It was foolish of the vigilante to analyze from the shadows. Izuku Midoriya realized as he saw the unyielding wall of stone and flesh stumbling in his direction. The sink was nowhere to be found. He had been discovered by the sink. And it was going to eat him. Before the first blow was even delivered, the crowd's roar threatened to drown Izuku with its physical wall of sound and tidal wave of bloodlust. The universe shrank to this circle of blood-soaked dirt as he stood in the middle of the pit, with the mountain of stone and flesh lumbering in his direction. His ribs ached like a relentless, glaring siren. It was a cluster of white-hot daggers twisting with each shallow, ragged breath he took, not a dull ache. His mind, which was normally a tornado of strategic planning, was slow, stuck in a haze of pain and incredulity. The man with the rock-skin quirk, his opponent, was a master of ruthless efficiency. Unlike the street thugs Izuku was accustomed to, he did not charge in screaming. His heavy, stone-like feet thudded against the packed earth as he moved forward with a steady, purposeful gait. With his elbows tucked in to protect his body and his stony fists shielding his face, he held his hands high in a traditional Muay Thai guard. It wasn't a fight. This person was a combative individual. He was trained. Izuku felt a new wave of icy, crystallized fear as he realized. The man, even in its panicked state, Izuku's mind gave him a codename, Stone Fist, Kensuke, closed the gap. He wasn't a crazy haymaker at the top. He jabbed. Although it was a testing, probing blow, it moved with the force and speed of a piston. After thousands of hours of reflex training, Izuku's body responded before his mind could. A flash of fire blazed through his fractured ribs as he turned on his back foot. The displaced air was a solid, buffeting force against his cheek as the stony fist smashed past his ear. It resembled a close call with a speeding truck. Izuku staggered back, attempting to clear his mind, breathe, and make room. However, Kensuke's MMA experience was evident as he was already flowing into his next move. It had been a setup jab. He then delivered a powerful roundhouse kick to Izuku's front leg. It was a traditional method of impairing an opponent's movement. Though his wounded body was a clumsy, incooperative vessel, Izuku saw it coming. He was unable to totally avoid it. By lifting his leg, he was able to absorb the impact on his shin rather than his thigh. It was an overwhelming connection. It was the sound of rock hitting bone, not of flesh hitting flesh. On impact, the thin layer of high-density plastic armor that was sewn into his cargo pants broke. An intense, concussive pain shot up from his shin and spread to his hip, creating a web of pain. He almost fell as his leg gave way, but he caught himself in time by placing a hand on the filthy floor. The audience let out a howl of approval. They were aware of the method and the expert use of violence. They had come to watch this sport. Screaming through the tidal wave of pain was analysis, a tiny, rational part of his brain. Examine or perish. He scurried back, gaining a valuable few feet of separation. His mind started processing the information, holding on to its old routines like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. Kensuke is the subject. Quirk, rock epidermis petrification, seems to provide superhuman strength and durability. Weight probably increases striking power. Fighting style, mixed martial arts, demonstrates ring control and is skilled in striking, Muay Thai guard, effective combinations. Assuredly possesses knowledge of grappling. Speed is a weakness. Despite his strong movements, he lacks explosive speed. One unknown variable is stamina. It is unknown how long the quirk will last. His own arsenal seemed pitiful, like a bunch of kids' toys compared to a tank. His punches would break against that stone hide, and the specter gauntlets needed contact. The pinnacle, his pressure point instrument, was ineffective. How could he unbalance a mountain? His judo and aikido were based on grabbing and unbalancing an opponent. How was he able to hold polished stone? They outclassed him. He was hurt. He would die. There was no panic in the thought. It was a straightforward, declarative assertion that made sense in light of the information at hand. And it was freeing in its icy finality. A single, instinctive need took the place of the fear of dying, live for the next 5 seconds. All of it, the weight of his self-imposed mission, the complicated game with the men in suits, the dream of becoming a hero, burned away like chaff in a furnace, leaving only the unadulterated, animalistic will to live. Kensuke moved forward once more, severing the pit's angle with swift, scavenging movements. He'd noticed Izuku's leg buckling. He was aware that he had drawn blood. He threw another jab cross combination, pressing his advantage. Izuku was ready for the sequence this time. He made no attempt to parry the jab as it came at his face. In a desperate attempt to get inside the larger man's reach, to clinch, to change this into a grappling match where he might have a chance, he instead dropped his weight low, allowing the punch to sail over his head, and drove forward. It was a disastrous error. The knees had fallen from his mind. Kensuke's right knee, a vicious, stony battering ram, shot upwards as he lunged forward. Izuku's already injured ribcage was directly hit by it. This was the sun exploding in his chest, if the first crack had been caused by lightning. A smear of pure, white, atomic pain engulfed the world. He was unable to scream. Instead, a wet, choked gasp of air was violently released from his body. There was a wet, grinding crunch as more ribs gave way. For a brief instant, his vision turned pitch black, and he found himself falling, detached from reality, lost in a sea of pain. The impact jarred every cell in his body as he struck the ground hard. He lay helplessly on his back, gazing up through a swimming, tear-filled haze at the mocking, blurry faces of the crowd. Overhead, a victorious silhouette against the harsh floodlights, was Kensuke. In order to crush Izuku's skull and put an end to the battle, he lifted a heavy, stone-clad foot and prepared to stomp down. It was this, the equation's conclusion. However, a memory emerged during that instant of complete surrender. It was a rainy night in a muddy clearing, not of All Might or his mother. The sensation of his body reacting without conscious thought, of slipping, of falling. Ukemi, the art of falling, the art of surviving. Izuku's body responded to the foot's descent, propelled by a muscle memory forged in pain. He made no attempt to block. He tucked his chin and rolled, a clumsy, excruciating motion that felt like ripping his own torso apart, with a last desperate rush of adrenaline. The ground shook as Kensuke's stomp struck the dirt next to his ear, missing his head and spraying him with dirt. The crowd roared with renewed energy after gasping. The rat continued to twitch. The game had not ended. Izuku had reached the base of Kensuke's legs after a desperate roll. He remained on the ground, his body a symphony of agony, his vision hazy. However, he was still alive. He was also near. As he recovered from his strong stomp, Kensuke was momentarily unsteady due to the last-minute evasion. There was a gap, not a chance, a gap, a tiny, nearly imperceptible crack in the face of oblivion. However, it was present. Rejuvenated by the adrenaline rush, his analytical mind grabbed hold of it. Kensuke was aiming for the traditional MMA finisher, the ground and pound. Dropping to his knees, he would slam Izuku to the ground and keep hitting him until nothing remained. Izuku had less than a second to take action. Izuku noticed Kensuke lowering his enormous frame. He hadn't dared to hope he could exploit the weakness he had theorized. He saw Kensuke's face, twisted in a sneer of imminent victory, through his blurred vision from pain. His eyes were visible to him. Not rock. They were biological, wet, and susceptible. He could see the fleshy inside of his snarling mouth and the soft tissue of his nostrils. A new plan was born out of sheer, cornered animal desperation rather than strategy or bravery. It was a terrible, repulsive scheme. It was his only remaining plan. He had changed from being a vigilante. He was no longer a budding hero. He was going to bite back, like a piece of meat in a butcher's pit. Time seemed to break as Kensuke's enormous body started to descend. All of it, the crowd's roar, the fire in his ribs, the taste of his own blood, was condensed into one crystal clear, horrifyingly clear moment. This was where things diverged. The path that took him to another place, or the path that resulted in his shattered body being scraped out of this pit and dumped on a pile of trash. Somewhere worse. He made a worse decision. His body exploded upwards from the floor, a vessel of pure, screaming survival instinct. He had no more strength, so it was a move of speed and a single, poisonous intent. Ignoring the shriek of protest from his broken ribs, he launched himself from his back like a striking snake. He clenched his right fist tightly as he moved. His palms concealed pressure switch pressed. In the dirt-choked air, the discrete metal contacts sewn over his knuckles spit out a ferocious, predatory arc of blue electricity as they crackled to life. In anticipation of the crushing finality of the ground and pound, Kensuke continued to descend, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. His attention was on the pin, on the first vicious blow he would land. He didn't witness Izuku's rise. Izuku's fist failed to strike either the sturdy jaw or the stony cheek. He had an unwavering goal, driven by a part of his mind that had abandoned all morality. He drove his electrified, sparking knuckles straight into Kensuke's right eye, a soft, moist, and susceptible target. It was a hideous symphony of the senses at the point of contact. His fingers sank into the yielding tissue, causing a sickening, wet squelch. This was followed instantly by the high-voltage discharge's sharp, irate bzzzzzt. Immediately, the arc's sound was muffled and replaced by a frying, sizzling sound that sounded like water hitting a hot pan. A high-pitched, gargling shriek of agony so pure and piercing that it seemed to rip a hole in the cavern's noise escape replaced Kensuke's triumphant sneer. Then the odor appeared. Izuku was made to gag by the sharp, distinct smell of burning meat and vaporized fluid, which hit the back of his throat. It was a horrifying sight. A glimmer of blue light briefly illuminated Kensuke's head from within. From the ruined socket came a fine spray of blood and smoke. The electricity took over his central nervous system, causing his entire enormous body to go rigid and convulse uncontrollably. His muscles turned into a stone prison that tormented him. His limbs locked and twitched as he fell sideways due to a catastrophic system failure rather than a blow. There was a broken pin. Izuku had no restrictions. As he lay on the ground, writhing and screaming, Kensuke's enormous hands clawed at his face in an attempt to remove the fire that had been lodged in his skull. A collective, stunned silence descended upon the crowd, which had been roaring for a clean, brutal victory. They had been startled out of their bloodlust by the abrupt turn in the attack's egregious, visceral foulness. This was not their sport's usual violence. There was more to this. Something private, something repulsive. A new sound, a roar that was somehow more intense, more primordial, broke the silence after it had lasted for one suspended heartbeat. It was a sound of awe and horror. They were not heard by Izuku. A blessed anesthetic was numbing the fire in his chest as adrenaline, a powerful, godlike chemical, flooded his system. This was his only chance, he knew. When a beast is injured, it is most dangerous. He could not allow Kensuke to heal. He was unable to think. With grim determination and blood-slick movements, he scrambled onto the larger man's flailing body. He was no longer a young man on a vigilante mission. Dismantling a larger predator, he was an animal. Kensuke was swinging his heavy stone arms wildly, blinded and lost in a world of pain. Izuku fought to establish dominance and avoided a flailing blow that would have crushed his skull. With the desperate efficiency of a man struggling for his life, he locked his ankles in a body triangle, wrapping his legs around Kensuke's thick torso. He had only ever seen this technique in online MMA tutorials. Kensuke had him on his back. He attempted to put the man in a chokehold, but the man's neck was a stone and muscle column. There was no way. He required an alternative. He was able to control him but not choke him. He might also harm him. With his position firmly established, Izuku unleashed a barrage of blows with his left, bare-handed hand, not wildly violent punches, but vicious, focused hammer fists. He struck the small, delicate areas of flesh that were not shielded by Kensuke's powerful quirk, such as the base of his skull, the back of his neck, and the mastoid process behind his ear. The thud of each blow was wet and dull. However, it was insufficient. Kensuke was an incredibly strong creature. He was fighting back despite having a damaged eye and an electrically jumbled brain, his survival instincts taking precedence over the pain. Trying to get to his hands and knees to buck Izuku off his back like an insect, he started to push himself up with a guttural roar. Izuku sensed that he was losing control. The man's raw power was too great for him. He would lose an attrition-based battle. His mind, now a deadly calculation machine with a laser-like focus, clung to a fundamental idea. The same one he had been taught since his first pitiful attempts at martial arts. Make use of the momentum and weight of your opponent. Kuzushi. Unbalancing is an art form. Izuku launched his last desperate gambit as Kensuke stumbled upward, exerting all his strength to stand up. His body performed the intricate, fluid motion with a grace that belied his wounds. In a classic Daishi Barai foot sweep, he hooked his left foot behind Kensuke's right ankle. At the same time, he let go of Kensuke's back and violently jerked his head back and sideways, putting all of his own little body weight into the twisting movement. The impact was immediate and disastrous. Kensuke was completely unprepared for the unexpected, multidirectional attack on his equilibrium because he was already blinded on one side, confused, and only focused on going forward and upward. They turned him over. His balance was totally ruined by the well-executed Kuzushi. The stone-heavy, giant man did not just fall. His own tremendous momentum turned into a deadly, uncontrollable force as he fell. And he was headed straight for the low, 3-foot-tall concrete wall that made up the fighting pit's sharpened edge, following Izuku's last, desperate tug. Like a guillotine, the sound sliced through the crowd's roar. It wasn't the snap of bone breaking. It ended with a sickeningly final crunch that was wet and concussive. It was the sound of a skull smashing against unforgiving, reinforced concrete with the full, destructive momentum of a 300-pound body behind it. The wall was painted with darker, grayer matter and a fine mist of red. Suddenly, Kensuke's body, which had been a raging storm of pain and muscle, went completely limp. His head was twisted at an angle that defied anatomy as he fell into a heap at the base of the wall, a hideous, shattered doll of stone and flesh. There was silence in the cavern. Even more deafening than the roar it had replaced was the sudden, complete silence. The harsh, ragged, wet sound of Izuku's own breathing was the only sound in the whole, enormous room. He moved slowly and awkwardly as he untangled himself from the body. His hands and clothes were covered in a warm, viscous mixture of Kensuke's and his own blood as he staggered backwards, pushing himself away from the body. He was standing in the middle of the pit, swaying on his feet, staring down at the motionless form. He was victorious. He was still alive. He had murdered him. It was a physical sensation, a leaden weight that fell into the pit of his stomach, so heavy that it felt like it might drag him down into the blood-soaked earth, rather than a thought. Then there was silence. One person started clapping, slowly and rhythmically. Then another, and yet another. The whole cavern erupted in a roar in a matter of seconds, far louder than anything that had preceded it. It wasn't just a sports fan's cheer. It was a frantic, frightened worship. He had offered them a sacrifice, and they had come for a violent show. He had displayed a degree of personal savagery that spoke to the deepest recesses of their wounded souls. Izuku raised his head and stared at the pit's edge. The Iron Fangs, leader, Guro, stood there and peered down at him. There was no anger or pleasure in his eyes, and his metal jaw remained motionless. It was the icy, piercing, cunning gaze of a predator reassessing a fresh, unanticipated danger on its domain. The expression was one of, "This changes everything." Izuku felt the pain return with the force of a tidal wave as the last of the adrenaline drained out of his system. The roar of the crowd swept over him like a wave of dirt as his legs failed and he fell to his knees in the middle of the ring. He glanced at his own blood-stained, quivering hands. A life had been taken by these hands. The boy was a murderer who had a dream of saving lives. In the sink, he had made it through his first trial. However, the price was a part of himself that was permanently buried in the pit's blood and dirt. He had clearly demonstrated that he was welcome here, and it was the most horrifying thought of all. The world was a distorted roar in the distance. Waves of the crowd's ecstatic, bloodthirsty cheers swept over Izuku, but they sounded as though they were coming from across a thick wall of water. He was kneeling in the middle of the pit, his nostrils heavy with the metallic odor of Kensuke's blood, a sickening perfume that seemed to fill his lungs. His gaze was fixed on his own hands. They were covered in a sticky, drying layer of gore and trembling violently. His own didn't feel like them. They had an uncanny feel to them, like hideous weapons grafted onto his wrists. Did I do that? In the storm of his collapsing mind, the thought was a mere whisper. Did those hands do that? Through his blurry vision, he perceived movement. In front of him, 2 pairs of heavy boots with steel toes came to a halt in the dirt. He was pulled to his feet by rough hands that caught him beneath his armpits. As the movement sent a new blast of pain through his broken ribcage, he let out a choked, agonizing cry. The harsh yellow lights of the cavern smeared into long, comet-like streaks as the world tipped violently. They had to drag his body like a dead weight while he was half-conscious. His head lolled sideways as they pulled him from the pit. He saw Kensuke's body in his final semi-lucid vision. The corpse was being lifted by 4 other Iron Fangs, their movements unceremoniously. They dealt with it as if they were workers raking up trash, their faces expressionless. They were just cleaning up the arena for the next game, not lamenting a fallen comrade. In some ways, the act of killing itself was less horrific than the sight of icy indifference. The world turned black as the darkness at the periphery of his vision finally closed in. He woke up to new pain. The main cavern was no longer where he was. He had been flung into the corner of a cramped, smaller room onto a lumpy, discolored mattress. It appeared to be a predator's den that had once been a control room or administrative office. The smell of rust, stale food, and unwashed bodies filled the air. One wall was lined with piles of scavenged weapons, such as crude blades welded from scrap metal and lead pipes with sharpened ends. He was right in the middle of the Iron Fang's domain. The finality of his circumstances felt more absolute than any prison bars, even though he wasn't in a cage. Over him loomed a figure. A wiry old man with eyes that held a deep, bottomless cynicism and a face like a dried-up riverbed. From his lips hung a lit cigarette, the smoke curling up into the faint light. "So, you're awake," the man said in a dry rustle of voice. Exhaling a cloud of smoke that smelled like burning chemicals, he took a long drag from his cigarette. "Guro wants you patched up. Seems you're more valuable alive than dead. For now." Izuku guessed that this was the doctor. Without offering consolation, the man, whom Izuku would learn to know only as Stitch, started his examination. His calloused, rough hands poked Izuku's torso with a cold, clinical brutality. Izuku's body arching off the mattress in a spasm of pure agony, he cried out as his fingers found the jagged, broken ends of the ribs. Stitch said, "Oh, good," with a glimmer of what may have been laughter in his lifeless eyes. He took another drag and said, "You can still feel that. Means your nerves aren't too shot to hell. That's a bad break. Punctured a lung, by the feel of it. You're lucky you're not choking on your own blood." After a brief absence, he reappeared carrying a tray made of rusted metal. It had a roll of dirty-looking bandages, a long, thick needle threaded with what appeared to be fishing line, and a bottle of dark, unlabeled liquid that smelled like industrial solvent. Stitch said, "No anesthetic in the sink," as though making a weather-related remark. Holding the bottle to Izuku's lips, he uncorked it. "Drink this. It won't stop the pain, but if you're lucky, you'll be too drunk to remember all of it." Seeing no other choice, Izuku took a sip. It was a disgusting liquid that smashed into his stomach like a ball of fire and burned a trail down his throat. It was strong, inexpensive, and raw. He experienced a brief, light-headed rush of intoxication, but as Stitch had assured him, it had no effect on the piercing, crystal-clear pain in his chest. "Now," said Stitch, extinguishing his cigarette on the ground. He gave Izuku a thick piece of folded leather and said, "This is going to be unpleasant. Bite down on this. You scream, you bite your tongue off. Your choice." Grasping the leather with his teeth, Izuku tasted the perspiration and grime of 100 other mouths. Stitch pinned him down with one hand on his shoulder and started setting the bones with the other. It wasn't a medical operation. It was ruthless, human carpentry. Izuku experienced a sickening internal friction that went beyond pain and turned into a pure, elemental force of violation as his own bones ground against one another. He could feel Stitch's knuckles piercing his torso's muscle and tissue, bringing the fractured ribs back into some sort of alignment. The world vanished. No Izuku, no doctor, and no cavern were present. All that existed was a universe of tearing, white-hot pain. On the mattress, his whole body trembled. The only thing preventing his shrieks from ripping his throat raw was the leather in his mouth. With a feeling of detached distance, he became aware that he was crying as a warm dampness touched his cheeks. He lay shivering and limp, drenched in cold sweat when it was finally over. His body was a tortured instrument, and his mind was a broken mirror. Unfazed, Stitch started to tightly wrap his torso, the rough bandages rubbing against his skin. The old man grunted and tied off the final knot with a firm tug that gave Izuku another shock of pain. "This'll hold you together," he said. He collected his crude tools and said, "For a while. Don't breathe too deep. Don't move too fast. Don't get hit there again. If you live long enough for the bones to knit, they'll probably heal wrong. You'll feel a pinch every time it rains. But that's not my problem." He started to walk away, but stopped in the door. He flicked his finished cigarette butt into the darkness and said, "You know, without turning around, I've patched up 100 fighters in this pit. Most of them die on this very mattress. But I've never had to patch one up after a fight with Kensuke. Kid was a monster. The fact that you're breathing and he's not, that's interesting." He then vanished, leaving Izuku by himself in a daze of agony, cheap alcohol, and the terrifying thought of his own survival. Izuku floated on a black sea of suffering for a dimensionless period of time. He did not live in consciousness. Rather, it was a collection of rocky, terrifying islands that he landed on before being pulled back under by the flood of pain. The cheap, flaming liquor that Stitch had pushed down his throat had unmoored his mind, not eased the pain. The filthy mattress beneath him was a raft in a storm he had created for himself, and he was caught in a fever dream. His mind, a prisoner inside his shattered body, replayed the battle in a horrifying loop. The noise. Kensuke's skull hit the concrete wall with a final, wet crunch. He could feel the texture of the sound in the bones of his spine and in his own teeth. It reverberated, visceral and sharp, in the voids of his memory. The rough bandages would chafe against his raw skin as he jolted awake, a strangled gasp catching in his throat, his body soaked in cold sweat. For a moment, the dim, low-ceilinged room would settle around him, the solitary, swaying bare bulb, the heaps of scrap metal, and he would recall his location. He was in the Iron Fang's den. The sink was where he was. After that, he would return to the pit and his eyes would close. The sensation, the specter gauntlet's metal contacts and the grotesque feel of his knuckles sank into Kensuke's eyes' supple, soft tissue. The grotesque bursting he felt all the way up his arm as it gave way. His own hand clenched and unclenched spasmodically on the filthy mattress, a tactile ghost that was a phantom sensation. Only the throbbing in his torso, which seemed to pulse in a rhythm all its own, as a counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart, made him vaguely aware of the passing of time. He was confined. He is a prisoner of his own behavior. He was victorious. He was still alive. He was starting to realize that this was his penalty. A fresh sound pierced the haze of his delirium, and he had no idea how long he had been lying there. The sound was rhythmic and heavy. Clank, scratch, clank, scratch, one of the boots dragging a little, as though it were weighted, and the sound of heavy boots on concrete. The sound approached and came to a halt just outside the temporary doorway leading to his room's corner. The main area's dim light was blotted out by a large silhouette. Izuku felt a new wave of pain shoot through his chest as his entire body went rigid. He opened his eyes and tried to concentrate. The Iron Fang's leader, Guro, was standing there. He didn't go in right away. He just stood on the threshold, his head cocked slightly, watching Izuku. There was an eerie stillness in his shark-like eyes, which were small and dark. They had the analytical eyes of a butcher evaluating a piece of meat. They were neither triumphant nor furious. Apart from his own ragged breathing, the only sound in the room was the faint, high-pitched whir of the servos inside the metal jaw, which was immobile. Guro entered after a protracted, tense moment, his presence seemingly sucking the air from the tiny room. With one hand, he pulled a heavy metal crate across the floor and sat down close to Izuku's cot, causing the crate to creak under his massive weight. He kept studying Izuku while leaning forward and supporting his enormous forearms on his knees. The stillness lingered, heavy and menacing. Guro wasn't rushing. Without a word, he was creating the new dynamic. The predator was him. The victim, Izuku, was injured and imprisoned. At last he said something. It was a low, gravelly rasp of a voice, distorted by the metal device that was his mouth, giving it an odd, mechanical echo. Guro scowled. Stitch says you'll live. He paused, his eyes fixed on you, and said, surprising. I saw the kick Kensuke gave you. Should have turned your insides to jelly. Kensuke was one of my best. Pure power. Not smart, not clever like you. But he was a good hammer. Reliable. And hammers are useful. The implication was obvious. My tool was broken by you. The smell of rust and stale sweat rolled off Guro as he leaned a little closer. I saw your face in the pit, rat. You were scared, but you weren't broken. I've seen 100 men break in that pit. Their eyes go hollow, they accept it. You got angry. And you got ugly. He made a vague gesture toward his metal jaw. I know ugly. Ugly works down here. Ugly survives. He fell silent once more, allowing the words to linger. Izuku's mind remained a battleground. The picture of Kensuke's ruined face flickered behind Goro's eyes as he spoke. A wave of nausea swept over him. The conversation felt like it was happening to someone else, a character in a bad play, and he was dissociating. His mind was elsewhere, attempting to escape the horror, while his body was here, a landscape of pain. What's your name? Guro asked abruptly, his tone direct and incisive. Izuku's mouth was thick with the taste of cheap liquor and blood, and his throat was dry. His voice was a hoarse croak when he tried to speak. The simple act of swallowing sent a shockwave through him. At last, he muttered. Izuku, the name sounding strange, like a holdover from a previous existence. Izuku, Guro said again, to test the sound. He nearly grinned, a monstrous sight as his jaw's metal plates moved. Doesn't matter. Down here, you are what you do. Kensuke was the hammer. Before him, there was the Ripper. You're the ghost. The rat who bit back. He got up and started to pace the cramped room, his heavy steps a slow, ominous cadence. You need to understand something about this place, Ghost. This isn't a prison, it's an engine. And it runs on two things: fear and hope. The pit provides both in equal measure. Every fighter who steps in there is fuel. The losers feed the fear. The winners, he stated directly to Izuku, they feed the hope. They make the others believe that maybe, just maybe, they can survive another day if they're just strong enough, just brutal enough. He made an ambiguous motion toward the cavern's deeper sections. It's a balance. The Chimera Core, the tech freaks, they get to play with their chemicals and their surgeries. They get to dream about making monsters. In return, the Iron Fangs keep the order. We run the pit. We control the flow of everything in and out of this hole. We provide the raw bodies, the muscle. They provide the upgrades, the juice. A perfect, bloody symbiosis. His face hardened as he sat back on the crate. And you have upset that balance. You didn't just kill a man. You broke a valuable, reliable piece of my machinery. Kensuke was a crowd favorite. His fights brought in a lot of bets, a lot of resources. His death creates a debt. Goro leaned closer, his metallic rasp becoming more noticeable as he spoke. He tapped a thick finger against his own metal jaw and said, a debt has to be paid. You can pay it with what's left of your broken body, or you can pay it with your skill. You take his place. You fight for the Iron Fangs now. You'll be my champion in the pit. Your victories will be my victories. They will bring us prestige. They will bring us resources. And in return, you get to live. You get this cot. You get our food, our water. You get Stitch's charming medical care. The cold, unwavering offer lingered in the air. There was no choice. It was an assertion of possession. Izuku's dead eyes were blank as he gazed at him. On the inside, however, his world was falling apart. His eyes were filled with a straightforward, ruthless confidence as he saw Kensuke's face, not in anger, but in the instant before the knee strike. Electric sparks appeared on his own hands. The ghost gave him a start up his arm. The crunch reached his ears. This was where he belonged. In his stomach, the thought was like a poisonous snake coiling. Here, his particular brand of desperate, shrewd violence was not only successful, it was appreciated. He wasn't an exception. He was a commodity. Goro noticed the internal conflict and the glimmer of fear in Izuku's otherwise blank face. He took advantage of the situation. So, what's it going to be, Ghost? Goro's voice was soft, almost gentle, which was more terrifying than his roar. You fight for me, or do I give what's left of you back to the pit, this time as entertainment for the scavengers? Izuku's mind was roiling with self-loathing and guilt. However, his animal side, the side that had rolled away from the stomp, the side that had targeted the eye, was yelling its response. Live, live, live. He opened his mouth. Without feeling or will, a single, raspy word escaped. It sounded like a chain snapping into position. Fight. Goro's jaw metal parted to show his sharpened teeth as a slow, horrible smile swept across his face. He rose, towering over Izuku for the final time, and said, "Good. Knew you were smart." The agreement was finalized. You belong to me now, kid. You belong to the pit. You live as long as you win. The day you lose, you pay Kensuke's price. It's that simple. Goro walked with a heavy, scraping gait, but his presence was overshadowed by a threatening silence. Izuku was by himself, lost in a sea he had created. Beside him were the objects Goro had thrown onto the cot. A small glass vial with a cork stopper that held a dark, murky liquid, a battered metal canteen, and a dense, gray block of what appeared to be nutrient paste. A feast fit for a king. The rewards of his triumph. The cost of a life lost. His eyes remained focused on the objects, and his thoughts, at last unburdened by Goro's imminent threat, started to crumble inward. His ribs hurt like a raging fire, but it was far away now, a physical reminder of a world his mind was frantically trying to escape. The reel of memories replaying behind his eyes, each one more detailed and vivid than the last, was the true source of his agony. The lunge. The world is constricting to one weak spot. Kensuke's eyes widened in shock and as pain began to appear. The spark. The Spectre Gauntlet's grotesque blue light, which he had invented and originally intended to be a defensive tool, was now being used as a means of intimate, private infringement. The noise. The wet sizzle. The non-human shriek came. The last crunch against the wall, hollow. A silent, choked sob caught in his throat as he squeezed his eyes shut. On the inside of his eyelids, however, the pictures were burned. He was unable to get away. He made an effort to evoke the emotions he was expected to experience: horror, guilt, and regret. On an intellectual level, he was aware that they should consume him. He had killed someone. There was no turning back from the line he had crossed. However, he found nothing when he reached for those feelings. Reaching into a deep, empty well was like that. All that was left was a deep and horrifying detachment from the boy he had been only hours before, a vast, reverberating numbness. This was where it all began. The actual harm. The coldness Guro had recognized as helpful, the dead eyes Stitch had observed. It was a psychic cauterization, a defense mechanism. Unable to comprehend the full scope of the horror, his mind was just shutting down. It was erecting a wall, with the cold, working survival machine on one side and the shattered, scared piece of him on the other. Lost in the struggle between what he had done and what he was unable to feel, he lay on the cot, his body shaking. He weighed his options for a long, eternal moment. He might decline to eat. He could wait for his wounds to heal. He could just quit, let his body fail, and keep Guro from getting his new weapon. It would be the end. A boy's last act of defiance because he didn't want to turn into a monster. Peace would prevail. Then his belly rumbled. In the silent room, the sound was startlingly loud. It was a demanding, guttural, low sound. An animal-like, primordial sound. It was the sound of his own body revealing the hopelessness in his mind. Beneath the layers of trauma and guilt, the organism was screaming its one, unquestionable, and basic truth: I want to live. The spell was broken by the sound. His body would not allow him to indulge in the philosophical discussion of his soul. Survival was a biological necessity, a current that was much stronger than his will to fight it. It wasn't a decision he made consciously. His hand moved on its own initiative, trembling with a tremor that was a combination of residual shock and weakness. The gray block of nutrient paste was its target. The block had the texture of industrial clay, was cool to the touch, and was dense. It had a slight chemical and chalky smell. His jaw ached in protest as he brought it to his lips. He made himself bite into it. There was no taste. It was bland, pure fuel. It scraped against his raw throat with a vile, gritty texture. He swallowed with a painful gulp, forcing it down despite his body's attempts to reject it. He bit into it again. And yet another. It was a heartless, mechanical act. The deliberate feeding of a machine that he had grown to despise. Then he reached for the canteen with a trembling hand. The water was wet but tepid, with a taste of grime and rust. The raw scrape in his throat was soothed. His body absorbed the hydration with a desperate greed as he took a deep drink. His gaze finally settled on the tiny glass vial. The analgesic. It seemed like the last step. Eating and drinking were acts of survival. It was an act of compliance to take this. Guro's maintenance was being accepted. It consented to be maintained in operational condition for the subsequent slaughter. He paused for a second. But as a stark reminder of the price of disobedience, the fire in his ribs flared. He uncorked the vial and swallowed the bitter, murky liquid in one go. The empty vial slipped from his fingers as he reclined. A slow, creeping warmth crept through his torso as the painkiller started to work. A heavy, throbbing ache replaced the sharp, crystalline edges of his agony as it started to dull. It was a huge relief. And frightful. Because the mental horror rushed in to fill the void left by the physical pain as it subsided. The memories became clearer, the sounds more distinct, and the emotions more palpable without the overwhelming agony in his body to divert his attention. It had been a shield of pain. He was helpless now. He looked up at the ceiling of his new cage, his new home, which was cracked and stained with water. He could hear the faint echo of the crowd's roar in his ears all the time. His vision was permanently marred by the face of the man he had murdered. He was no longer the resolute young man who studied heroes, Izuku Midoriya. In the pit, that boy had perished. Something else was what remained. A shell, a tool, a specter. Guro's brand new hammer. Guro said in a metallic voice, "Your next fight is in 3 days," and he remembered it. The crowd wants to see what their new monster can do. When he closed his eyes, he could not find any sleep. All that remained was the memory of the cost he had incurred, the pain, and the darkness. The first dead man's soul was the price he paid. He was still alive, and as he lay there, a cold, logical question from the survival machine that was now in charge came up out of the deepest part of him. How much would the second cost? The following 2 days were a dull, painful blur. The sun and moon did not have the same rhythm in the sink. Instead, time was measured in the pauses between suffering, the provision of scant food, and the unrelenting, recurring reenactment of Kensuke's death in Izuku's mental theater. The majority of that time was spent on the dirty mattress, his entire world condensed into the small, unclean room. A persistent, Deep, foundational ache had replaced the first, all-consuming pain in his chest. Each inhalation was a deliberate effort, a quick gasp that was akin to rubbing against an exposed nerve. Stitch never returned. His services were reserved for injuries that prevented a fighter from standing, and that was the clear message. The continuous suffering was merely a necessary component of the healing process. His constant companions were the intrusive memories. They had evolved beyond mere moments of terror. In a deranged act of self-preservation, his analytical mind had started to break them down. Second by second, he would break down the fight while lying there with his eyes focused on a crack in the concrete ceiling. The eyeball lunge, high reward, high risk. It was a desperate gamble. There was no assurance of success. Was there another weak spot I could have targeted with the taser? The throat, beneath the arm, no. Too much movement, too much protection. An instantaneous, incapacitating shock could only be directed at the eye. The last takedown. It was important to use his momentum. An unadulterated implementation of the fundamentals of judo. He would have recovered if I had attempted to bludgeon him more. He was simply too strong. The pit wall, the environment, was used improvisedly. One that works. This dispassionate, icy analysis added another level of horror. As though it were a school assignment, he was criticizing his own violence. It was teaching him. To think that a part of him was cataloging the act of killing as successful techniques made him feel very sick. The desensitization started in this way, not because he had forgotten the horror, but because he was learning to classify it and to emphasize it until it was just data. 2 members of Iron Fang entered his room early on the morning of the 3rd day, which was the day of the fight. They weren't Stitch or Guro. Only low-level thugs with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. Izuku was starting to recognize the new look on their faces as it was a mix of fear, resentment, and a strange, reluctant respect. He had evolved from a stray rat. Kensuke had been killed by him. A simple black t-shirt and loose-fitting cargo pants, both worn but clean enough, were thrown at him by one of them. The other set a full canteen and a block of nutrient paste on the ground. Guro wants to see you, grunted the first. Get up, eat, the whole sink is betting on you tonight. He felt a shock of icy fear at the words. He was no longer merely battling for his life. He served as a metaphor. A horse for racing. A benefit. A web of fire spread across his torso as he forced himself to sit up. He drank the water and ate the paste slowly and mechanically. The soft fabric hurt his bruised skin as he tugged on the garments. The 2 thugs escorted him out of the room when he was ready, walking beside him like handlers of a dangerous, unpredictable animal rather than guards of a prisoner. Already there was a sick, joyous hum in the main cavern. The people of the sink were congregating, their faces showing hunger and eagerness for the violence at the heart of their universe. However, he was not taken to the holding pens by the pit. Rather, they guided him to Guro, who had his arms folded across his enormous chest and stood on a raised platform with a view of the entire cavern. Ghost, Izuku said, and Goro's metallic voice rasped. With a head gesture, he gave the order to stand next to him. Look. Izuku could see the sink spread out in front of him from this position. For the first time, he could clearly see it, not as a terrified intruder, but as an incooperative resident. In his own cruel manner, Guro was teaching him about local politics. This is the Iron Fang's domain. The gate, the pit, the trade lanes. We are the skin and the bone of this place. We are the law, what little there is. We provide the muscle. We keep the animals from eating each other, unless it's in the ring, for sport, Guro said, sweeping a hand across the main cavern, the fighting pit, the makeshift market, and the tunnels leading back to the surface. He then turned his attention to the cavern's interior, to the enormous, sealed blast door in the industrial complex behind it, which was the cause of the steady, low hum. And that, he spat on the ground, his voice tinged with an odd mix of disdain and dependence, is their world. The Chimera Core, the tech freaks, they're the brain and the blood of the sink. They have the workshops, the labs. They keep the power running. They make the juice that makes my fighters stronger, faster. They make the mods that turn a man into a machine. He glanced at Izuku. We keep them safe from the chaos. They keep my champions competitive. A delicate balance. Izuku's mind was active as Guro spoke, taking in and evaluating information. This was a torrent of vital intelligence, not merely a tour. He took note of the Iron Fangs, patrol routes, the locations of Goro's lieutenants, and the distinct boundaries separating the 2 areas. He observed that the members of the Chimera Corps never moved alone but rather in small, orderly groups. The silent haughtiness with which they carried themselves contrasted sharply with the raucous savagery of the Iron Fangs. His mind started mapping not only the actual area but also the unseen forces of dependency, fear, and power that ran through it all. He was searching for blind spots, patterns, and roots. He was trying to find an escape route. His eyes met someone else's, breaking his compulsive scanning of the cavern. A young man stood across the stretches, close to the boundary of the Chimera Corp's domain. This man was different from the other tech freaks. They were either clinical and aloof or showed evidence of their own self-experimentation. Composed. He was slender, with sharp, perceptive features and well-groomed dark hair, a sharp contrast to the dirty, unkempt appearance of nearly everyone else in the sink. He was dressed simply in a dark, clean jacket. He wasn't looking at the pit or the crowd. He had Izuku in his sights. 2 points of concentrated intensity in a sea of chaos, their gazes locked across the cavern. It was impossible to read the man's face. It was neither the fearful awe of the lower-ranking thugs nor the predatory evaluation of Guro. It was a look of intense, critical interest. It was the expression of a scientist watching a brand new, surprising phenomenon that had just surfaced in his lab. It was the expression of a chess player who had just witnessed a move not found in any of the books made by his opponent. Something unrelated to his wounds sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. This individual, whoever he was, viewed him as a variable rather than a tool or a monster. An exception, and anomalies were either co-opted or eradicated in a setting as brutally organized as the sink. Izuku looked away after a long, unsettling moment, his heart thumping against his fractured ribs as he returned his focus to the pit. Now he could add a new, profoundly disturbing piece of information to his rapidly growing mental map. He was a gladiator shackled to the Iron Fangs and Goro's property. However, he also attracted the attention of their ruthless, cunning competitors. In addition to being imprisoned physically, he was caught between two diametrically opposed, heinous ideologies. The baptism was only getting started. Guro gave Izuku a long, deliberate period of time to stand on the edge and watch the world below that was rotting. Watching the boy's eyes search the cavern and the analytical gears turning behind his blank expression seemed to give the Iron Fang leader a grim sense of satisfaction. This was more than just an introduction. It was a branding act that burned Izuku's mind with the truth of his ownership. Goro's metallic voice sounded, "See him." Izuku saw that the leader's eyes had followed his own to the slender, calm figure on the outskirts of the Chimera Corp's domain. Goro's vocalizer made a dry, rattling sound that might have been a laugh. "That's Daiki, one of their little princes. The one with the clean hands and the big ideas. He thinks he's better than the rest of us 'cause he can read a book without moving his lips. He talks about evolution and a structured society. Words, empty words. All he wants is a better class of slave for his experiments." Izuku's shoulder was clamped down by Goro's hand, a slab of scarred muscle and meat. The enormous weight served as a tangible reminder that he was a prisoner. A word of advice, Ghost. Don't ever trust a tech freak. They'll smile at you while they're sharpening the needle they plan to stick in your spine. Soon after, the tour, as it were, came to an end. With the two silent thugs on either side of him, Izuku was led back to his corner. Every step had been a battle with the screaming nerves in his torso during the brief exposure to the main cavern. With a flurry of new information racing through his mind, he fell onto the mattress. Territories, supply routes, factions, and a precarious, violent symbiotic relationship. A new name, too. Daiki. The name didn't feel like the pit fighters' savage nicknames. It felt accurate, risky. He was spared a long wait. He was systematically performing a series of slow, painful stretches to prevent his muscles from seizing. Maybe an hour later, when a shadow appeared over his doorway. Izuku's head jerked up, and his entire body tensed at once, alarm lighting up every nerve. Daiki was the one. He had arrived by himself. With his hands in the pockets of his neat, dark jacket, he stood at the entrance to Izuku's shabby room. Despite his relaxed posture and lack of a weapon, he exuded a sense of complete confidence that was more menacing than any overt threat. Izuku could hear the guttural muttering of the two Iron Fang guards stationed down the hall, who had noticed him. They did not move to intercept, but they had tensed, their hands straying to the lead pipes at their belts. Daiki's lone foray into their domain was a calculated act of immunity and power. The grunts knew better than to start a fight without their king's permission because he was a diplomat from a rival country. She said, "MMH the new boy, Daiki. In sharp contrast to the iron fangs, snarling, his voice was clear, calm, and unaccented. It was a shock, like a splash of ice water, to hear his full name, a name he hadn't heard since he'd fallen into this hole. "May I come in?" Izuku remained silent. He merely forced himself to sit against the wall, his eyes narrowed, his face a blank mask of pained indifference. Taking his silence as permission, Daiki entered with a smooth, silent elegance. With a look of mild, clinical distaste, he scanned the cramped, filthy room before his dark, perceptive eyes found Izuku. Daiki started off by saying, "I watched your fight against Kensuke," in a tone reminiscent of a professor presenting an intriguing thesis. From a tactical perspective, it was remarkable. Guro and his followers saw a vicious spectacle. "I saw an impressive display of problem-solving under extreme duress. Your use of leverage to negate a significant mass and strength advantage was a textbook application of physics. And the final biological targeting, it was inspired. Crude, but inspired." Izuku's heart froze. Daiki wasn't complimenting him on his strength or courage. He was boasting about the way he killed. Daiki went on, "You are an anomaly, boy," his eyes intense. "A baseline human with no discernible quirk, yet you were capable of neutralizing a chemically and genetically enhanced fighter through pure tactical innovation. You are unique, and anomalies are the single most valuable resource in the Chimera Corps." He moved in closer. Izuku resisted the impulse to recoil. "Listen to me. Guro sees you as a hammer. A fascinating, surprisingly effective hammer, but a disposable one nonetheless. He will use you. He will throw you against his enemies until you inevitably shatter. That is his way. It is wasteful. It is primitive." Daiki's tone conveyed a sense of contempt. "We, on the other hand, see potential. We see a foundation upon which something truly great could be built." It was this, the proposal. Izuku's thoughts were racing, dissecting each word and facial expression. "This place," Daiki said, pointing to the cave beyond the room, "is a crucible. It is a laboratory for the human condition under pressure. Guro and his brutes are content to let it remain a pit of screaming animals, a cycle of meaningless violence. We believe in something more. We believe in evolution, in forging a new kind of human from the broken parts of the old. We use science, chemistry, gene splicing, cybernetic surgery, to accelerate that process. To give the willing the power to rise above their biological limitations. To impose order and purpose on this chaos." To get closer to Izuku's eye level, he lowered himself a little. "Your body is broken. Your ribs, by my estimation, are healing poorly and will trouble you for the rest of your short life. We can fix that. We could reinforce your ribcage with a woven carbon fiber mesh during the healing process, making it stronger than steel. Your reflexes are excellent, a product of instinct. We could enhance your nervous system with a synaptic catalyst, granting you near instantaneous response times. We can make you better than you are. Stronger, faster, a survivor not by desperate chance, but by intelligent design." The offer hung in the air, monstrous and seductive. Izuku felt the lure for a brief moment. It was a strong siren's call to have the ability to never be a victim again, to have the pain go away, and to have his frail body made indestructible. However, his strongest defense, his analytical mind, cut through the temptation. Freedom was not what Daiki was offering. He was proposing an alternative, more advanced cage. Guro desired to be the owner of his physical form. Daiki desired to take control of his own biology and change his essence until Izuku Midoriya was merely a ghost inside a machine they had built. Their goal was to perfect the sink, not to get out of it. He was also viewed as their most promising new product. Izuku said, "I belong to the Fangs," in a raspy whisper. It was a straightforward assertion, a shield. It showed nothing of the internal conflict. A faint, knowing smile curled Daiki's lips. Allegiance in the sink is a fluid concept, determined by who can offer the most compelling path to survival. Guro offers you a slightly longer, more painful death. I am offering you a rebirth. He stood up. Think about it. The sound of heavy, approaching footsteps broke the tense silence. With his enormous body filling the doorway and his metal jaw clenched with dormant aggression, Guro emerged. Guro howled, "Get your lab coat away from my fighter, tech freak," in a low-pitched threat. "He's not another one of your sewer rats to experiment on." Daiki's expression remained composed and his air of superiority remained unshaken as he turned to face the Iron Fang leader. "I was merely congratulating him on his victory, Guro, and extending a professional courtesy. It would be a shame for such a unique asset to be broken." He nodded curtly to Guro before turning to face Izuku one final time. The offer stands, Anomaly. When you tire of being a blunt instrument, you know where to find us. Daiki then turned and left, leaving a pulsating tension behind him as he vanished back into the main cavern. Guro turned his enraged eyes to Izuku after watching him leave. As he entered the room and kicked the metal crate Daiki was sitting on, causing it to screech across the floor, he growled, "Don't you ever talk to him again, you hear me? You are mine." Guro loomed over Izuku to regain control, to pull his attention away from the dizzying potential of politics and back to the immediate, bloody reality. Forget the tech freaks and their empty words. You have a job to do. Tonight, for me, there's a minor crew, a bunch of scavengers who call themselves the Scrappers. They've been getting bold, thinking they can muscle in on one of our trade routes. We're settling it the old way. In the pit, you'll be fighting their champion. Guro hunched down, his breath hot and odorous, his face inches from Izuku's. His name is Cutter. He likes blades. I want you to make an example of him. I want you to show every single piece of trash in this hole what happens when they cross the Iron Fangs. I want you to show them what my new monster can do. It was a silent, icy purgatory in the hours before the fight. Izuku made no effort to sleep. He was aware that there would be no escape from sleep, only a new form of agony characterized by shattered memories. Instead, he got ready. He stretched slowly and deliberately, hissing in agony as the motions tugged at his still healing ribs. Instead of attempting to gain strength, he was assessing his own malfunctioning machine, recording every point of failure and burning nerve, and becoming familiar with the new, constrained geometry of his own body. His thoughts were strangely at ease. Something colder and sharper had taken the place of the frantic, terrified boy who had been flung into the pit against Kensuke. A new internal state had been created by the agony and introspection of the previous 3 days. Beneath his thoughts was a thick layer of crystalline, pragmatic focus, but beneath it was still the horror, a permanent, cold bedrock. At this point, the survival machine was well under control. With the same detached rigor he had once applied to the quirks of heroes, he examined Goro's order, make an example of him. An illustration, not a corpse, necessarily. A corpse was simple, but it was a definitive, unambiguous statement. A more complex example might be provided. It might be a message of control, dominance, and terror that foretells a far worse outcome. Killing was a conclusion. It was a warning to leave an enemy alive but broken, compelled to tell his allies about his complete humiliation. That was a political control mechanism. He was prepared when the 2 Iron Fang thugs came for him. He moved between them with a calm, steady purpose that unnerved them rather than the defeated shuffling of a prisoner. The roar of the crowd struck him as he entered the main cavern. This time, it was different. It had previously been a generic wall of noise, a cries for blood. Tonight the sound gathered, concentrated, and grew as he appeared. They were applauding him. His new name, which he hated and which felt like a mark on his soul, was chanted by them. Ghost, ghost, ghost. He was not arrogant by the sound. The weight of their heinous expectations was like a physical burden. He was their new god of violence, their new spectacle. The blood-soaked soil beneath his feet was familiar as he entered the pit. His rival was already awaiting him. His energy was twitchy and nervous, and he was wiry and quick. His tiny, ruthless eyes darted from side to side. Guro had mentioned that his name was Cutter. The reason why became clear at once. A crude but wickedly sharp blade, made from sharpened pieces of sheet metal with handles wrapped in filthy cloth, rested in each of his hands. He smiled, revealing a row of discolored teeth, and whirled the blades in a gaudy, cocky show. He was a brutish creature, all bravado and quick twitch muscle. There was no signal, and the fight started. Cutter burst forward, a tornado of movement. His speed was dizzying, but he lacked Kensuke's power. With his blades a silver blur, he quickly closed the distance, aiming a series of quick slashing blows at Izuku's arms, face, and throat. Izuku went on the defensive right away. The pain in his torso prevented him from moving freely. He was unable to duck low or twist. All he could do to avoid it was to turn and move quickly. He could feel the whisper of the blades as they hissed past his face. His forearm sustained a shallow, charred cut after a glance cut through the material of his sleeve. The audience started jeering. They had seen a vicious, ruthless monster before, but this one was different. This fighter, who was defensive and slow, was overpowered by a faster opponent. Izuku, however, wasn't merely defending. He was thinking. He was downloading data and surviving the first, tumultuous storm. Cutter uses his right blade to take the lead. He sacrifices accuracy for intimidation with his broad slashes. He overcommits his weight on each lunge, and his footwork is sloppy. He uses his speed to open doors, but after every attack, he exposes himself for a split second. Izuku saw it after a good minute of what appeared to be a desperate retreat. The moment he had been anticipating. Frustrated by his failure to deliver a serious blow and encouraged by the cries of the crowd, Cutter sprang forward with a determined, strong stab that went straight for Izuku's stomach. The lethal overextension was the cause. Izuku moved in that minuscule second. He didn't strike back with his own blow. Force was not met with force by him. He moved. He turned on his heel and let Cutter's lunge carry him past in a single, smooth motion that seemed to defy his injuries. He applied the tenets of the redirection technique known as Aikido. His left hand sprang out, gently guiding the charging knife arm past him rather than blocking the attack. Simultaneously, his right hand clamped down from above on Cutter's wrist. Cutter's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't realized he was now hopelessly off balance and caught because he had been so preoccupied with his attack. Izuku contorted. The outward wrist turn was a neat, textbook kotegaeshi. Using Cutter's own forward momentum to propel the technique, he applied precise, controlled pressure to the joint. Cutter's arm ached so badly that he screamed. His right blade clattered to the ground as his suddenly nerveless fingers opened. Izuku continued. Cutter was forced to his knees, his arm bent at an uncomfortable, unnatural angle as he continued the turn. Having rendered his opponent immobile, Izuku applied more force to the wrist lock. There was a loud, nauseating snap. The clean, sharp sound of the bone breaking broke through the crowd's cacophony. With a gurgling cry of excruciating pain, Cutter dropped his second knife. The battle was over. Instead of a violent altercation, it had concluded with a quick, graceful, and completely horrifying demonstration of exceptional skill. Confused, the crowd fell silent. A monster, a ghost, had been promised to them. A surgeon had been brought in. Izuku stood above his opponent's screamed, shattered body. The mission was not yet complete. He needed to lead by example. He glanced down at Cutter before carefully and slowly picking up one of the blades that had fallen. He raised it so that its edge glinted in the harsh cavern lights. The weight of hundreds of eyes watching him, anticipating the kill, was palpable. His eyes shifted from the blade in his hand to the man kneeling in front of him, his face filled with tears and fear. He briefly saw the picture of Kensuke's caricatured face. The sensation of murder. The void. He decided. He slammed the blade down with a violent, abrupt motion. Squeezing his eyes shut, Cutter flinched, preparing for the fatal blow. However, the blade missed his flesh. The point buried itself only one shaky inch from Cutter's cheek as it plunged deep into the pit's crowded, blood-stained earth. The only sound in the cavern was the solid thunk of the impact. With his face against Cutter's ear, Izuku leaned in close. His voice was a low, icy whisper that was intended only for him, but it was intended as a broadcast to the entire world that was watching. Izuku said, "I could have opened your fucking throat," in a flat, emotionless voice. "I could have put this blade through your eye. I want you to feel how close you were. I want you to go back to your pathetic crew and tell them that I let you live. Tell them that this territory belongs to the Iron Fangs. And tell them their ghost showed you mercy, today." Cutter was left kneeling there, trembling uncontrollably, the knife trembling in the ground next to his head like a steel tombstone as he straightened up. Izuku walked out of the pit, turning away from him. The audience was silent as they took in what they had just seen. For the Sink, this was a novel form of violence. It was the cold, calculated cruelty of an executioner who had stayed his own hand, not the bloodthirsty fury of a beast. It was a display of power so absolute that it was demonstrated without a death. It was much more terrifying in its own right. Izuku ignored their looks and the burning pain in his side as he moved through the divided crowd. He continued walking until he was in front of the platform where Goro was standing. His own eyes were a dead, flat void as he looked directly into the leader's eyes. Goro's face lit up with a slow, broad, robotic smile. The expression was one of deep, contented approval. His new hammer was more than just a forceful tool. It had intelligence. It had message-sending skills. It knew how to arouse fear without breaking itself needlessly. It was a much more useful instrument than he had thought. Izuku nodded in a small, nearly imperceptible way before turning and returning to his den corner. He had finished the fight. It had been a transaction. He had no regrets or feelings of guilt. Only the dull, throbbing ache in his body and a vast, cold emptiness. He remained a monster. However, He had been the one with the leash this time. It was a minor, somber triumph in a battle for his own soul, but it was the only victory that mattered down here.
I will continue the series in next part. Till then, bye bye.